When parents hire someone to care for their children, they make a choice based on trust. They open their homes, share their daily routines, and give someone access to the people they love most. Parents assume the caregiver will protect their children, not harm them. But sometimes that trust is broken in the worst way possible. These aren't strangers snatching kids from playgrounds. These are the nannies who lived in the home, the babysitters' parents called for help, the caregivers who seemed safe because families already knew them. Across different countries and different years, some of these trusted helpers became kidnappers, using their position to take children away from their families. Today, we're covering cases where nannies, babysitters, and other trusted adults kidnapped the children they were supposed to protect. Each case led to arrests, trials, and prison sentences, but the damage was already done. What follows will be disturbing, not because of stranger danger, but because the danger came from inside the home. Case number 1. Fatima Alexander. In 2016, a New York City family experienced this betrayal firsthand. As reported by ABC 7 News and NBC New York, Fatima Alexander had worked as their nanny for an extended period. She was not a temporary hire or a last-minute replacement. The family relied on her for daily childcare, trusting their 3-year-old daughter without reservation. The Manhattan District Attorney's criminal complaint states Alexander took the child and vanished for 15 hours. The case shows how established caregiver relationships can collapse suddenly. No before conflicts existed between Alexander and the family. No recorded threats or concerning behaviour preceded the incident. The disappearance occurred during what appeared to be a normal day of childcare. By the time the parents realised something was wrong, their daughter had been gone for hours. CBS News reported Alexander eventually returned the child unharmed, but the physical safety of the victim did not erase the legal reality. News coverage documented she was arrested and charged with kidnapping. The case reinforced a crucial legal principle. The crime of kidnapping does not require permanent removal, physical harm, or ransom demands. Unlawful restraint and removal of a child from parental control qualifies as kidnapping under New York law. The Alexander family had built their childcare arrangement over time. However, Fatima Alexander was not a new employee learning the household routine. She had been with the family long enough to understand their expectations, schedules, and the child's specific needs. This duration created familiarity that made the eventual crime more unexpected. The family had observed her work for months, watching how she interacted with their daughter, how she responded to the child's needs, how she managed daily routines. Professional nanny relationships in New York City typically involve clear boundaries and expectations. The caregiver arrives at a specified time, performs defined duties throughout the shift, and departs at scheduled times. Shortly after, Alexander's employment followed this pattern, without change that anyone noticed. She supervised the 3-year-old during the day, while the parents worked at their respective jobs. The arrangement was professional and businesslike, not an informal favour between friends. The family paid her appropriately for her time and expertise. The employment relationship appeared stable and mutually beneficial. Alexander received regular pay and presumably found the work acceptable, since she continued showing up for shifts. The family gained reliable childcare that allowed them to maintain their work schedules without constant worry about their daughter's supervision. This type of stable arrangement is what every working parent hopes to establish with childcare providers. Battery Park City, where the family lived at 41 River Terrace. Per NBC, New York, is a planned community in Lower Manhattan, built on landfill along the Hudson River. The neighborhood is known for its high-rise residential buildings, waterfront parks, and affluent families. The family's building sits in an area with large security infrastructure, including doormen, surveillance cameras, and access-controlled entrances. These security features, common in upscale Manhattan residential towers, were supposed to provide safety. Instead, they merely recorded the beginning of a nightmare, when security footage captured Alexander leaving with Gabriella at 9:15 a.m. on May 17, 2016. The Preschool of America at 25 Marketplace was only 5 blocks from the family's home. The short distance made it a routine trip that Alexander had completed successfully many times before. The school's staff knew to expect Gabriella each morning and maintained attendance records tracking when students arrived. However, when Gabriella failed to appear that day, staff made note of her absence but did not right away alert the family, as they had no protocol requiring instant notification for non-arrivals. The Manhattan District Attorney's criminal complaint documents how Mark Russo, Gabriella's father, attempted to call Alexander's cell phone in the early afternoon. The calls went directly to voicemail, suggesting either the phone was turned off or the battery had passed away. Mr. Russo then attempted to reach Alexander at her Brooklyn home in Flatlands, but those calls also went unanswered. The pattern of failed communication attempts recorded in the complaint would later help prosecutors establish that Alexander had deliberately made herself unreachable. Chief of Detectives Robert Boyce told reporters that Alexander was a trusted woman with no known criminal record. Boyce's statement to the media stressed how unusual the case was. Not a caregiver with a recorded history of concerning behaviour, but rather someone who had functioned apparently normally in her role until suddenly committing a serious crime. The NYPD leadership's public comments reflected their own surprise at how someone with Alexander's background could commit such an act. Rebecca Russo, Gabriella's aunt, was present at the River Terrace building during the search. She spoke to reporters gathered outside, expressing the family's anguish. "You see it on the news and it's happening," she told ABC 7 News, capturing how surreal the experience felt. The aunt's presence during the crisis illustrated how extended family members were mobilized to support the parents through the ordeal, though their presence could do nothing to locate the missing child. No recorded friction existed between Alexander and the parents before the incident. Investigators who later examined the relationship found no evidence of arguments about pay rates, working conditions, or approaches to childcare. The relationship appeared functional and professional from every external perspective. The family trusted Alexander enough to allow her to take the child outside the home unsupervised for activities like park visits or errands. This level of trust showed genuine satisfaction with her performance and character judgment. The 3-year-old had formed a bond with Alexander through daily interaction. Young children develop attachments to regular caregivers. The young child recognized Alexander as a familiar, safe adult. She responded positively to Alexander's presence and instructions. This attachment made the child cooperative and trusting, which would later prove dangerous when Alexander harmed that trust. Alexander's background before joining the family remains largely undocumented in public records available after the incident. No before police involvement linked her to the family before she began working for them. No restraining orders, criminal complaints, or reported incidents appeared in the investigation's findings about her history. She was presented as a standard childcare worker, used in a standard professional arrangement. Whatever personal circumstances or issues she had remained hidden from the family's view. The living and work arrangements reflected typical Manhattan nanny employment patterns. Alexander did not live with the family, which meant she maintained a separate residence. She travelled to their home for scheduled shifts and left at the end of her working hours. This separation of work and personal life meant the parents had limited insight into her circumstances outside the hours she spent with them. They knew her professionally and in the specific context of childcare, but not personally in terms of her relationships, financial situation, or mental state. The geographic realities of New York City childcare create specific dependencies. Manhattan parents working full-time jobs cannot easily supervise young children themselves during work hours. The city's structure requires reliance on childcare services or hired help. The Alexander family's situation was not unusual or especially risky compared to thousands of other families making similar arrangements every day. Both parents worked, requiring full-time supervision for their young child during business hours. Alexander filled this necessary need. The family depended on her to maintain their household's functional routine. The relationship between parents and hired nannies always involves a basic act of trust. Parents must believe that the person they hire will feed their children appropriately, keep them safe from harm, and respond to emergencies correctly. Return them at the end of each shift. The Alexander family extended this trust fully to Fatima Alexander, based on her months of reliable performance. But they had no reason to withhold trust or implement extra monitoring beyond what seemed appropriate for professional childcare. The absence of warning signs made the eventual disappearance more shocking to everyone who knew about the arrangement. No concerning behaviour had preceded the incident that would have alerted the parents to possible danger. No missed days without explanation, no unexplained absences, no signs of emotional instability or behavioural changes. Alexander appeared reliable and consistent until the precise moment she stopped being either. The sudden shift from trustworthy to dangerous gave the family no opportunity to protect their daughter. The day began without any irregularity that would have alerted the Alexander family to coming danger. Fatima Alexander arrived for her shift at the expected time, following the pattern established over months of employment. The parents prepared for their respective workdays while their nanny assumed childcare responsibilities. The morning routine was familiar to everyone involved. repeated so many times that it had become automatic and unremarkable. The 3-year-old knew Alexander well enough by this point that her presence brought no anxiety or resistance. Young children can be remarkably perceptive about adults, often sensing discomfort or danger that they cannot say. The young child showed no signs of distress when her parents left for work, and Alexander took over supervision. The child trusted her nanny completely, as she had been conditioned to do through months of positive daily interaction. At some point during the shift, Alexander made the decision to leave with the child. The exact timing and Alexander's thought process during those moments remain known only to her. What is recorded is that she departed the family's residence with the 3-year-old at some point during what should have been a routine caregiving day. This departure was not inherently suspicious or alarming in itself. Nannies routinely take children outside the home for various activities. Park visits provide fresh air and physical exercise. Library trips support early literacy development. Errands like grocery shopping teach children about daily life tasks. Parents actively expect and encourage their caregivers to provide this kind of environmental enrichment, rather than keeping children confined indoors all day. The Alexander family had likely given their nanny standing permission to take their daughter on such outings. The departure itself would not have seemed concerning to neighbours or others who might have observed it. The mechanics of modern parent-caregiver communication typically involve regular check-ins throughout the day. Text messages update parents on their children's activities, moods, and any notable events. Phone calls handle more substantive communications or resolve questions that arise during the day. Photo messages allow parents to see their children even while at work. This constant connectivity has become standard practice in contemporary childcare arrangements, providing reassurance to parents who cannot be physically present with their children. When Alexander failed to respond to the parents' contact attempts, the situation shifted from routine to concerning. The first unanswered message or call might have been dismissed. Perhaps Alexander's phone battery had passed away. Perhaps she was occupied with the child in a situation where checking her phone was impractical. Perhaps they were in a location with poor cellular service. Parents understand that caregivers cannot always respond right away. A reasonable delay is expected and tolerable, but as minutes built up into hours without any response, reasonable explanations became less plausible. A dead phone battery would be charged at some point during the day. An activity requiring full attention would eventually conclude. Poor cellular service would improve once they moved to a different location. The continued silence, extending well beyond what any innocent explanation could account for, transformed parental concern into alarm. The normal end time for Alexander's shift approached and passed without the child being returned. This crossing of the expected boundary represented an urgent increase in the parents' understanding of the situation. Late arrivals happen in urban environments due to traffic or transportation delays. Caregivers might call to explain they are running behind schedule. Alexander did not call to explain any delay. She simply failed to appear with the child at the time when her shift should have ended. The child was not returned, and Alexander remained unreachable. At this point, the parents now faced a realization that had shifted from inconvenience to worry to genuine fear. Something was seriously wrong, but their daughter was somewhere with a person who was not responding to any attempts at contact and who had not returned their child despite the scheduled end of the working day. The situation had moved beyond any innocent explanation into territory that demanded immediate action. The emotional progression parents experience during such a crisis follows a predictable pattern, recorded in cases of child disappearance. First, concern gives way to worry, then to fear, then to panic, as the situation continues without resolution. The Alexander parents moved through these stages as the day advanced without their daughter's return. Each passing hour without contact increased their desperation and terror. No ransom demand arrived to at least provide an explanation for what was happening. Kidnappers, motivated by money, typically make their intentions known relatively quickly. They want to begin negotiations and get payment. But the silence from Alexander meant the parents could not even understand what was happening, let alone take steps to resolve it. Were they dealing with a kidnapping for profit? Had Alexander experienced some kind of emergency? Had something happened to both the nanny and the child? The absence of information prevented the parents from taking any effective action beyond reporting the situation to authorities. Investigators would later determine that no immediate financial motive existed behind Alexander's actions. She had not planned to extort money from the family in exchange for their daughter's safe return. This finding removed one possible explanation for the disappearance, but left the parents with even less understanding of why their trusted nanny had taken their child and vanished. Crimes motivated by money are at least understandable, even if unacceptable. Alexander's apparent lack of financial motive made her actions more disturbing because they defied obvious explanation. The parents contacted the New York Police Department when the situation clearly exceeded a misunderstanding or innocent delay. The surveillance footage that captured Alexander's departure with Gabriella would become crucial evidence in the investigation. The River Terrace building's CCTV system recorded residents and visitors entering and exiting through the main entrance. The timestamp of 9:15 a.m. was established exactly when Alexander and Gabriella left the building together. The video showed both figures walking normally, with no signs of distress or struggle. To any casual observer watching the footage, it appeared to be a routine morning departure for a routine trip to preschool. Chief Boyce explained to reporters that Alexander had been riding around on mass transit with Gabriella. Her MetroCard electronic payment record showed multiple subway rides throughout the day across different lines in Manhattan. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority's tracking system recorded each time Alexander swiped her card to enter subway stations, creating a digital map of her movements through the city. These records contradicted Alexander's later explanation that she had gotten lost trying to reach Central Park. Investigators' analysis of the transit data showed Alexander's pattern of movement suggested purposeful travel rather than confusion. Someone genuinely lost would show repeated attempts to retrace their route or find familiar landmarks. Instead, Alexander's MetroCard history showed her traveling to multiple different locations throughout Manhattan over the course of hours. She successfully navigated various subway lines, showing competence in using the transit system rather than disorientation or inability to find her way. Chief Boyce told media that Alexander claimed she just wanted to take the child for a walk, and that she was going around the city to Central Park, riding the subways with the child. This statement from Alexander, made during police questioning, provided no reasonable explanation for why such a walk would extend for 15 hours, why she would not say her intentions to the parents, or why she would fail to take Gabriella to school as required by her job responsibilities. The Daily News captured video footage of Alexander's dramatic return to the River Terrace building shortly after midnight. The video, posted to social media by reporter Andy Mai, showed Alexander entering the lobby with Gabriella, while family members and police officers right away surrounded them. The footage captured what Mai described as a scuffle between Alexander and family members, who were simultaneously relieved to see Gabriella and enraged at Alexander for what she had done. The raw emotional intensity of that moment, joy and fury mixed together, played out in the building's lobby, under the watch of the same security cameras that had recorded the pair's departure 15 hours earlier. A 1010 WINS radio reporter, who was present at the scene, asked Alexander where she had been with Gabriella during the 15-hour disappearance. The reporter's account documented Alexander responded with a single word: nowhere. This non-answer provided no explanation, no apology, and no acknowledgement of the trauma she had inflicted on the family. The response showed either an inability or unwillingness to take responsibility for her actions, even as she was being arrested. Mark Russo spoke briefly to DNA Info by phone the day after Gabriella's recovery. He confirmed that his daughter was home and doing well physically. However, Mr. Russo stressed that his family was shocked by Alexander's actions. DNA Info reported the family had known Alexander for 15 years, a duration that made her betrayal impossible to understand. 15 years of apparently normal interaction had given the family no indication that Alexander posed any danger to their child. Missing child cases trigger immediate and intensive response protocols from law enforcement. Officers understand that time is urgent when young children are unaccounted for. Every minute matters when determining what has happened and locating the missing child. NYPD officers began gathering necessary information as soon as they were notified. When was the child last seen? What was she wearing? Who was responsible for her care? What was the caregiver's full name and contact information? Were there any known conflicts or concerns about the caregiver? Did the family have recent photographs of both the child and the nanny? These questions form the basis of missing child investigations, providing officers with the information needed to begin their search. Alexander's name emerged as the central focus right away, because she was the last person known to have custody of the child. In missing child cases, investigators start with who had access and work outward from there. Alexander's failure to return the child or respond to contacts made her the obvious person of interest. Officers attempted to reach her directly through phone calls, while simultaneously beginning physical search efforts. The parents' statements to police stressed the trust they had placed in Alexander and how completely that trust had been harmed. They explained that she had worked for them for months without incident. They had no concerns about her character or reliability until this moment. The betrayal they felt compounded their fear for their daughter's safety. Someone they had welcomed into their home and their child's daily life had turned that access into an opportunity for crime. The lack of warning signs that might have prepared the parents for this crisis contributed to their shock and self-recrimination. Parents in such situations often torture themselves with questions about what they missed. Could they have prevented this? Were there signs they should have noticed? The investigation would, in the end, show that Alexander had not shown obvious red flags before the kidnapping, but the parents could not have reasonably anticipated what she would do. But this factual reality provides little emotional comfort to people who feel they failed to protect their child. As evening turned to night without resolution, the family's ordeal deepened. Young children have bedtimes and routines, but the 3-year-old would be tired, confused about why she was not home, and potentially frightened. But the parents could not comfort their daughter or ensure she was being cared for appropriately. This helplessness intensified their anguish beyond the base fear for her physical safety. Fatima Alexander removed the 3-year-old from the family's control without permission, consent, or legal authorization. The act met the precise legal definition of kidnapping under New York State Penal Law Section 135. The statute requires proof of unlawful restraint or removal of a person. The victim's age and the kidnapper's role as a paid caregiver did not create exceptions or excuses for the criminal act. Alexander's employment gave her legitimate access to the child, but that access came with clearly defined boundaries and responsibilities. Taking the child and disappearing for 15 hours exceeded those boundaries catastrophically. The child remained separated from her parents with Alexander for about 15 hours from the time concerns first arose until her eventual return. During this extended period, the young child was in the exclusive control of someone who had removed her from her family without authorization. The 3-year-old was too young to understand what was happening, why she was not going home as usual, or why she could not see her parents. At her developmental stage, the child would have experienced confusion, fear, and distress without the cognitive capacity to make sense of her situation. For 15 hours, a family lived in the space between hope and horror, not knowing if their daughter was safe, scared, or already beyond help. The physical well-being of the child during those 15 hours remained unknown to her parents throughout the ordeal. But they could not confirm that Alexander was feeding their daughter appropriately. But they could not ensure that the young child was being kept warm, dry, and comfortable. But they could not verify that their child's basic needs were being met. This inability to ensure proper care for their at-risk young child added another dimension of torture to the parents' experience. The fear was not just about potential harm, but about the certainty that they could not fulfill their basic parental responsibilities while their daughter was in Alexander's unauthorized custody. No physical harm in the end came to the child during the disappearance, as determined by medical evaluation after her recovery. Investigators and physicians who examined the victim following her return found no injuries, bruises, or signs of physical abuse. The absence of physical trauma represented the best possible outcome under horrific circumstances, but the lack of harm or injury did not in any way diminish the legal severity of the crime Alexander had committed. New York's kidnapping statutes do not require proof of physical abuse or injury. The unlawful restraint and removal themselves make up the criminal offence, no matter what of how the kidnapper treats the victim during the abduction. The distinction between kidnapping with physical harm and kidnapping without physical harm is legally important for charging decisions and potential sentence enhancements, but both scenarios represent serious felony offences. However, Alexander's decision not to physically injure the child during the 15 hours did not transform her actions into a lesser crime. She had still unlawfully taken and restrained a 3-year-old child, depriving the parents of custody and control over their daughter for an extended period. Alexander did not attempt to permanently conceal or keep the child. She eventually brought the young child back rather than continuing to hide her or attempting to flee to another area with the victim. The circumstances surrounding the return, whether Alexander came back voluntarily, was intercepted by law enforcement, or was persuaded by someone else, remain unclear from publicly available information. What is recorded is that the child was returned alive about 15 hours after the family lost contact with Alexander. The decision to return the child prevented the case from escalating into a long-term or permanent abduction scenario. Cases where children are taken and never returned, or are recovered only after weeks, months, or years, involve even more large trauma and investigative complexity. Alexander's return of the victim meant the family was spared the extended uncertainty and grief of a prolonged disappearance. But the duration of 15 hours still qualified as kidnapping under the law. There is no minimum time threshold that must be exceeded for unlawful restraint to make up kidnapping. The crime occurs at the moment of unauthorized taking, not after some specified period has elapsed. The psychological impact on the 3-year-old, while impossible to measure precisely, concerned child development experts and mental health professionals. Even very young children who cannot consciously remember traumatic events may experience lasting effects on their attachment patterns, sense of security, stress responses. The separation from her parents during this urgent developmental period occurred at an age when consistent caregiver presence is necessary for healthy emotional development. The child's brain was forming foundational understandings about safety, trust, and predictability during these young child years. Alexander's actions disrupted this developmental process in ways that might not be fully apparent until the child grew older. The crime highlighted basic vulnerabilities inherent in all childcare arrangements, especially those involving nannies who have unsupervised access to children. Parents hiring childcare help necessarily extend enormous trust to their employees. They must believe that these caregivers will act in the children's best interests, follow parental instructions, and maintain appropriate boundaries. This trust is not optional. It is required for childcare relationships to function at all. Parents cannot personally supervise their children every moment, while simultaneously maintaining employment or managing other life responsibilities. They depend on hired help to fill the gaps. Alexander took advantage of the access and trust granted to her through the employment relationship. But she did not need to break into the family's home to take the child. But she did not need to physically overpower anyone or use weapons. But she did not need to trick the child into leaving with her. She simply had to fail to return the young child as her employment required. The crime's mechanics were simple, precisely because Alexander's position as the trusted nanny removed most of the practical barriers that would prevent a stranger from abducting the same child. This dynamic distinguishes caregiver abductions from stranger kidnappings that receive more media attention and parental fear. Strangers face major practical obstacles when attempting to take children. They must overcome parental supervision, public observation, and the child's own wariness of unknown adults. Trusted caregivers face none of these barriers. They have been granted legitimate access, so their presence with the child appears normal and authorized. This appearance of legitimacy delays detection and enables the crime to progress further before intervention occurs. During the 15-hour ordeal, the family experienced emotional distress that extended far beyond ordinary worry or stress. But they did not know if their daughter was alive or dead. But they could not determine whether Alexander intended to return her or whether the disappearance was permanent. But they could not assess whether their child was being cared for, abused, or something worse. The uncertainty was itself a form of psychological torture. The human mind, when presented with unknown outcomes involving loved ones in danger, often imagines worst-case scenarios that may or may not align with reality, but that feel absolutely real in their emotional impact. NYPD officers worked throughout the 15-hour period to locate Alexander and the child. They used available investigative resources, including surveillance systems that might have captured images of Alexander and the young child, interviews with witnesses who might have seen them, coordination with transportation authorities to check for sightings, attempts to track Alexander's cellular phone location. The manhunt for a missing 3-year-old mobilizes major police resources because the potential for tragedy is so high and because public pressure to find missing children is intense. The focus of the investigation remained consistently on recovering the child safely rather than on ensuring Alexander's arrest, though both objectives were obviously important. In cases involving missing children, law enforcement prioritizes the victim's safe recovery above all other concerns. Arresting the abductor matters, but not as much as getting the child back unharmed. This priority shaped how officers approached the search and how they would have handled contact with Alexander if they had located her before she returned the child voluntarily. Every hour that passed without resolution increased the statistical likelihood of a tragic outcome. Law enforcement and child safety experts know from large research that the first hours after a child's disappearance are urgent. The longer a child remains missing, the greater the danger they face. This grim reality created immense pressure on the officers searching for the 3-year-old and deepened the family's anguish as time continued passing without news. When Alexander in the end returned the child, the relief experienced by the family was immediate but complicated. They had their daughter back, physically safe, which was the single most important outcome possible, but the psychological damage had already occurred. The trust that formed the basis of their caregiver relationship was irreparably destroyed. The family would never again experience the uncomplicated confidence they had before felt when entrusting their child to a nanny's care. Alexander had poisoned not just their specific relationship, but the broader category of caregiver trust. The incident forced the family to confront uncomfortable realities about weakness and control. They had done everything seemingly reasonable to protect their child. They had hired someone, observed her performance over time, and maintained regular communication during working hours. Acted quickly when something seemed wrong, yet their daughter had still been taken from them for 15 hours. This recognition that reasonable precautions cannot eliminate all danger creates lasting psychological impacts for parents. The illusion of control over their children's safety had been shattered in a way that could never be fully restored. The 3-year-old's own experience during those 15 hours remained largely opaque to observers because of her age and limited verbal capacity, but she could not provide detailed accounts of where Alexander took her, what happened during the time away from her parents, or how she felt about the experience. Investigators could piece together physical locations through evidence, but the child's subjective experience, her fears, confusion, and emotional state could only be inferred rather than directly known. This gap in understanding left questions that would never be fully answered about what the victim had endured. The parents reported their daughter missing after Alexander failed to return her at the expected time. NYPD officers began a missing child investigation right away. The urgency of such cases necessitates rapid response. Every minute matters when a young child is unaccounted for. Officers established that Alexander was the last person known to have custody of the child. This fact made her the main focus of the investigation from the start. Detectives interviewed the parents to understand the nature of Alexander's employment, her typical behaviour, and any potential warning signs that had been missed. The police investigation showed what the family had not wanted to believe. Their trusted nanny had become their daughter's captor. The investigation proceeded without clear leads about Alexander's location. She was not responding to calls or messages from the family or from law enforcement. The child was with her, but their whereabouts remained unknown. Officers had to consider multiple scenarios: accidental separation due to emergency, intentional hiding, or potential flight from the area. NYPD used available surveillance resources to attempt to track Alexander's movements. Security cameras in Manhattan provide large coverage in many areas. Investigators reviewed footage from locations near the family's home and from transportation hubs. The goal was to determine which direction Alexander had travelled and whether she had left the borough. As hours passed, the investigation expanded. More officers joined the search. The case was treated with the seriousness appropriate to a missing 3-year-old. Media outlets were contacted to broadcast information about the child's disappearance. The public was asked to watch for Alexander and the young child. About 15 hours after the disappearance began, Alexander returned the child. The exact circumstances of the return are not detailed in public records. Whether Alexander came back voluntarily, was intercepted by police, or was convinced to return by someone else remains unclear from available sources. The crucial fact is that the child was recovered alive. Law enforcement right away took Alexander into custody, but she was not free to leave once the child was returned. The disappearance and prolonged absence made up kidnapping, and officers arrested her based on this act. But the safe return of the victim did not erase the crime that had occurred. Medical professionals examined the child to assess her physical and psychological condition. The examination confirmed no physical injuries. The young child appeared healthy, but medical evaluation cannot fully measure the emotional impact of being separated from parents for an extended period. But the child was young enough that articulating her experience was not possible. The parents' statements to police stressed the emotional ordeal they had endured. They described the terror of not knowing where their daughter was, or if she would be returned. They explained how the trust they had placed in Alexander made the betrayal more severe. Their victim impact began long before any formal legal proceedings. Investigators sought to understand Alexander's motive. The absence of ransom demands or before conflicts made the reasoning unclear. Alexander's mental state and decision-making during those 15 hours became part of the investigation, but the legal proceedings would focus on the act itself rather than speculative motivations. Fatima Alexander faced kidnapping charges in New York criminal court. The legal proceedings in Alexander's case centered on interpreting New York's kidnapping statute. New York Penal Law, Section 135.25, states kidnapping in the second degree occurs when a person abducts another person. The law defines abduction as restraining someone with intent to prevent their liberation. Prosecutors cited in court proceedings argued Alexander met this definition by taking Gabriella without permission and keeping her for 15 hours while refusing to respond to contact attempts. Per court observers, the defense strategy focused on arguing that Alexander never intended to permanently harm or keep Gabriella. Defense attorneys in kidnapping cases often try to distinguish their clients' actions from more predatory abductions involving ransom demands or violence. This legal theory argues the absence of harmful intent should reduce culpability, but prosecutors maintained New York law doesn't require proof of intent to cause permanent harm. The crime occurs when someone unlawfully restrains and removes another person, regardless of their ultimate plans. Legal experts who commented on the case noted the 15-hour duration was significant for establishing kidnapping, rather than a lesser charge. If Alexander had returned Gabriella after an hour or two, prosecutors might have had difficulty proving unlawful restraint, but the timeline established by evidence showed 15 hours of keeping a child, while ignoring frantic parents, clearly exceeded any reasonable interpretation of her employment authority. The prosecution built its case around the unlawful removal and restraint of the child. Under New York penal law, kidnapping in the second degree applies when a person abducts another person. The victim's age intensified the seriousness of the charge. Prosecutors stressed the abuse of trust inherent in the crime. Alexander held a position of responsibility. The family had granted her authority to care for their child based on an employment relationship built over time. She harmed this trust by removing the child without consent and failing to return her for 15 hours. The prosecution argued that this betrayal made the crime especially egregious. The courtroom would determine whether 15 hours of unlawful restraint by a trusted caregiver deserved the full weight of kidnapping law. Defense arguments focused on the absence of physical harm to the child. Alexander's attorney likely argued that the child was returned safely, with no injuries or evidence of abuse. The defense may have presented Alexander's decision to return the victim as evidence of non-malicious intent. In kidnapping cases, defense attorneys often attempt to distinguish their clients' actions from more harmful or predatory abductions. Court records show the court considered legal definitions rather than emotional interpretations. New York law defines kidnapping through the act of unlawful restraint and removal, not through the kidnapper's final intentions or the presence of physical harm. The prosecution did not need to prove that Alexander intended to permanently keep the child or cause physical injury. The 15-hour removal itself satisfied the legal requirements. Bail proceedings determined whether Alexander would remain in custody while awaiting trial or be released under conditions. Kidnapping charges typically result in major bail amounts due to the severity of the offence. Court records indicate the court considered flight risk, danger to the community, and the nature of the crime when setting bail conditions. Court appearances followed standard criminal process. Alexander was arraigned, meaning she was formally charged and entered a plea. The case proceeded through pre-trial hearings where evidence was reviewed and legal arguments were presented. Both prosecution and defense had opportunities to present their positions to the court. The prosecution's case relied on clear facts. Alexander had custody of the child through her employment. She removed the child without permission. She failed to return the child for 15 hours despite parental attempts at contact. She provided no explanation during the disappearance. These facts established the elements of kidnapping without requiring complex evidence or witness statements in court. Character witnesses may have been called by either side. The prosecution could present a statement in court from the parents about the emotional impact and the breach of trust. The defense might have sought character references for Alexander from other sources to establish her previous behaviour and reputation. But public records do not detail the specific witnesses called during proceedings. The trial progressed toward resolution through the criminal justice system. Whether through plea agreement or trial verdict, the legal process aimed to hold Alexander accountable for removing and restraining a child for 15 hours without parental consent. The court imposed consequences for Fatima Alexander's actions. Kidnapping convictions in New York carry serious penalties. The judge considered the nature of the crime, the victim's age, and the betrayal of trust when determining the appropriate sentence. Victim impact evidence played a major role in the proceedings. The parents described the 15 hours they spent not knowing if their daughter was alive. They explained how they had trusted Alexander completely, and how that trust made the crime more severe. The emotional trauma extended beyond the immediate event. The family would carry the psychological effects long after their daughter's physical return. A judge would have to weigh whether safe return diminished the crime, or whether emotional terrorism against a family deserved full punishment. The prosecution stressed that kidnapping law does not require permanent removal to be valid. The crime occurred during the 15 hours of unlawful restraint. However, Alexander's decision to eventually return the child did not undo the kidnapping. The court agreed with this interpretation. Duration does not negate the crime once the elements of kidnapping are satisfied. The victim's impact extended to the 3-year-old child as well, but at her age, she could not fully say what she experienced. But medical and psychological professionals recognized that the separation from her parents, no matter whether she was physically harmed, could have lasting effects. Young children need stability and consistency. The abrupt removal from familiar surroundings and people creates trauma even without explicit abuse. The sentencing reflected the legal system's recognition that caregiver helped make possible crimes represent specific betrayals. Parents must rely on childcare providers. The law provides severe penalties for those who abuse that necessary trust. Alexander's position as a long-term nanny made her crime more serious, not less, because it took advantage of an established relationship. Defense arguments about lack of harm likely received limited consideration. The court applied the law as written. New York's kidnapping statute focuses on the act of unlawful restraint and removal, not on the outcome. But the child's safe return mattered for the family's relief, but did not eliminate the crime that had occurred. The situation reinforced legal principles that protect children from caregiver exploitation. Courts must send clear messages that individuals trusted with childcare cannot violate that trust without serious consequences. The sentence imposed on Alexander served both as punishment and as deterrent to others who might consider similar actions. The child returned to her family permanently. The parents right away ended Alexander's employment. No possibility existed for continuing the caregiver relationship after the kidnapping. The family faced the challenge of rebuilding their sense of security and trust in childcare arrangements. The case received attention in New York City media and among parenting communities. Discussions focused on how to prevent similar incidents. Parents questioned whether background checks, references, or other vetting methods could identify potential problems before hiring caregivers. But the reality is that Alexander had no recorded warning signs. She appeared to be a standard nanny until she committed the crime. The Alexander family would never again experience the simple confidence of handing their child to a caregiver without fear lurking beneath the trust. The incident prompted conversations about emergency protocols. What should parents do when a nanny becomes unresponsive? How long should they wait before calling the police? The 15-hour duration raised questions about whether earlier intervention might have shortened the ordeal. But parents faced difficult judgment calls when trying to distinguish between innocent explanations and genuine emergencies. This demonstrates that caregiver kidnappings do not always involve harm or permanent removal to be severe. The psychological impact on the family was severe, despite the child's safe return. Trust, once broken in this way, cannot be easily restored. The parents would always carry the memory of those 15 hours of uncertainty and fear. For law enforcement, the case reinforced the importance of treating nanny disappearances seriously from the start. The quick response by NYPD helped ensure the child's safe recovery. Delayed reaction could have led to a very different outcome if Alexander had chosen to flee further or make different decisions. The long-term effects on the 3-year-old remain private. Childhood trauma can manifest in various ways as children grow. The parents would need to monitor their daughter's emotional development and provide support as needed. The incident occurred during formative years, when experiences can shape attachment patterns and trust responses. The case remains instructive for understanding how even long-trusted caregivers can act unpredictably. Parents operate in a space of necessary trust when hiring help with their children. They cannot eliminate all risks. The Alexander case shows that vigilance, while important, cannot prevent all potential problems. Some betrayals occurred despite reasonable precautions. If you want us to keep digging into these disturbing cases, hit like and subscribe. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. While Fatima Alexander's 15-hour disappearance with Gabriella remains unexplained to this day, the next nanny we're covering spent months planning her crime through an elaborate deception that fooled everyone around her. Case number 2. Nadine Faye Manukau Togiavalu. Nadine Faye Manukau Togiavalu maintained a false pregnancy for months. In Manukau Togiavalu's mind, taking another person's baby, she had spent months preparing for a child. She had told people she was expecting. She had created expectations that required fulfillment. However, when her fabricated pregnancy could not produce an actual baby, she turned to theft to resolve the narrative she had constructed. The elaborate deception began months before the kidnapping. However, Nadine Faye Manukau Togiavalu did not spontaneously claim pregnancy on the day she took the baby. She built the lie over time, adding details and evidence that made it believable. The sustained nature of the deception showed planning rather than impulsive action. She got baby items in preparation for the birth she claimed was approaching. Cribs, clothes, diapers, and other infant necessities appeared in her control. These purchases reinforced the reality of her pregnancy to anyone who saw them. The physical evidence supported her verbal claims. Every baby outfit purchased and every pregnancy update shared was another brick in the basis of a crime months in the making. Manukau Togiavalu showed detailed knowledge of childbirth and newborn care. She could discuss hospital processes, birthing plans, and postpartum recovery. This knowledge likely came from research rather than lived experience. Her ability to speak convincingly about pregnancy and birth made her deception more believable. The psychological aspect of maintaining a false pregnancy for months requires commitment. Manukau Togiavalu had to remember her lies, keep her story consistent, and respond to questions appropriately. She managed these challenges successfully enough that people close to her remained convinced. As her claimed due date approached, the pressure to produce an actual baby intensified. People expected to meet her newborn. They anticipated birth announcements and hospital visits. Manukau Togiavalu faced a crisis point where the deception could no longer be sustained without producing a child. This pressure created the motive for kidnapping. Taking someone else's baby solved the problem her false pregnancy had created. She could present the stolen infant as her own biological child, fulfilling the expectations she had built. The crime became, from her perspective, a solution rather than an increase. The lead-up involved identifying an at-risk target. Manukau Togiavalu needed access to a newborn infant. She found this access through her role as a caregiver or helper to the victim's family. The trust the parents placed in her created the opportunity she took advantage of. No immediate warning signs alerted the family to danger. Manukau Togiavalu's behaviour appeared helpful and appropriate, but she did not make threatening statements or behave suspiciously in the parents' presence. Her false pregnancy seemed unrelated to her interactions with their baby. The family could not have anticipated that her deception would lead to their child's abduction. The planning extended beyond the false pregnancy itself. Manukau Togiavalu needed to determine how to actually take the baby without immediate detection. She had to consider timing, location, and how to make the abduction appear legitimate. The crime required forethought about logistics and execution. Nadine Faye Manukau Togiavalu removed the newborn infant without parental consent while acting in a caregiver-associated role. The abduction took advantage of the trust the family had placed in her, but she did not need to break into their home or use harm. Her access came through invitation and established relationships. The kidnapping occurred without physical struggle or resistance. The infant was too young to resist or cry out in a way that would alert others to danger. Manukau Togiavalu simply took the baby during a moment when she had unsupervised access. The ease of execution reflected how dangerous caregiver trust can become when taken advantage of. In the time it takes to walk out a door, a newborn disappeared from her family and into the arms of a woman whose entire pregnancy had been a lie. The situation did not right away appear suspicious to anyone who might have observed it. Manukau Togiavalu looked like someone legitimately caring for an infant. She had established herself as knowledgeable about babies. The false pregnancy narrative supported the appearance that she might be with her own child rather than someone else's. The crime relied on assumed legitimacy rather than force. People generally assume adults with infants have rightful custody, unless obvious signs suggest otherwise. Manukau Togiavalu took advantage of this assumption, but she did not need to sneak or hide. because she appeared to have legitimate reason to be with a newborn. The timing of the abduction corresponded with the conclusion of her false pregnancy timeline. She had claimed to be due around this period. Taking the baby allowed her to present the stolen infant as her own biological child, born from the pregnancy she had fabricated. The crime resolved her deception crisis by substituting a real baby for the imaginary one. After taking the infant, Manukau Togiavalu likely presented the baby to people who had been expecting her to give birth. Friends and family would have congratulated her. They would have wanted to see the newborn. She could fulfill these expectations using the stolen child. The kidnapping enabled the continuation of her elaborate lie. The victim's family realized their baby was missing when Manukau Togiavalu failed to return the infant as expected, or when they otherwise discovered the absence. The panic of discovering a newborn has been taken is immediate and overwhelming. Parents of infants are especially at risk to this fear because newborns cannot survive independently and require constant care. The abduction period lasted until police intervention. During this time, the baby remained with Manukau Togiavalu. The infant was separated from parents who were desperately searching. The newborn was too young to understand what was happening, but was completely dependent on a kidnapper for survival needs. Medical concerns about the baby's welfare intensified the urgency of the investigation. Newborns require specific care, including feeding schedules appropriate to their age. The parents could not ensure their child was receiving proper care while separated. This medical weakness added another dimension to the trauma. The victim's family contacted New Zealand police right away upon realising their newborn was missing. Missing infant cases receive the highest priority response from law enforcement. Every moment matters when an at-risk newborn is unaccounted for. Police started immediate action to locate the baby and determine what had happened. Investigators quickly identified Nadine Faye Manukau Togiavalu as a person of interest based on her last known access to the infant. The family provided information about who had been helping with childcare and who had the opportunity to take the baby. Manukau Togiavalu's name emerged as the focus of the investigation early. Police investigators would soon uncover that the missing newborn case was linked to a months-long deception that made the crime both premeditated and psychologically complex. As officers gathered information, inconsistencies in Manukau Togiavalu's pregnancy story became apparent. People who knew her were questioned about when they first learned of her pregnancy, what evidence they had seen, and whether they had witnessed the birth. The investigation showed that no hospital records existed for Manukau Togiavalu giving birth. No medical professionals can verify her pregnancy. The false pregnancy unravelled under scrutiny. Family members and acquaintances who had believed Manukau Togiavalu was pregnant confronted the reality that she had deceived them for months. The revelation shocked people close to her. They had trusted her claims without reason to doubt until the kidnapping forced closer examination. Police located Manukau Togiavalu with the stolen infant. The recovery operation prioritised the baby's safety. Officers ensured the child was removed from the kidnapper's custody without harm. The newborn was right away assessed by medical professionals to determine physical condition and any needs requiring urgent attention. The infant was found alive and physically unharmed. Medical evaluation confirmed the baby had survived the abduction period without injury, but the separation from parents and the circumstances of the kidnapping created concern about potential psychological impact, even at such a young age. Infants bond with their main caregivers through consistent care, and disruption of this bonding process can have effects. Manukau Togiavalu was arrested at the scene of recovery. She faced immediate charges related to the kidnapping. The evidence against her was large. The false pregnancy claims recorded by witnesses, the missing infant found in her control, the parents' statements about her unauthorized removal of their child. During questioning, the full scope of Manukau Togiavalu's deception emerged. Investigators recorded the timeline of her false pregnancy claims, the purchases of baby items, and the communications where she discussed her impending birth. This evidence established planning ahead. The kidnapping was not an impulsive act, but the end result of months of planning. The investigation also examined whether Manukau Togiavalu had targeted other families or babies. Police needed to determine if this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. Available records suggest this was a single kidnapping case, but the false pregnancy itself had been shared with multiple people, creating many victims of the deception, even if only one baby was actually taken. Nadine Faye Manukau Togiavalu faced kidnapping charges in New Zealand criminal court. The prosecution built a case that stressed both the planning involved and the abuse of trust. The months of false pregnancy claims showed planning ahead. The exploitation of caregiver access showed deliberate targeting of an at-risk infant. Prosecutors presented evidence of the sustained deception. Witnesses said in court about Manukau Togiavalu's pregnancy claims, the updates she provided, and the baby items she showed. This statement in court established that the kidnapping was not spontaneous, but rather the planned conclusion of a long-running deception. The courtroom would need to determine not just whether she took the baby, but whether months of lies about pregnancy counted as planning ahead in kidnapping law. The false pregnancy became central to the prosecution's narrative. The elaborate deception showed Manukau Togiavalu's willingness to manipulate people over extended periods to achieve her goal. The planning involved in maintaining the lie for months transferred to the kidnapping itself, making it a more serious crime than an impulsive act. Physical evidence supported the prosecution's case. The baby items purchased by Manukau Togiavalu, the social media posts about her pregnancy, and communications with friends and family all recorded her deception. This evidence was objective and difficult to refute. The false pregnancy was not speculation, but recorded fact. Medical evidence confirmed Manukau Togiavalu had not given birth. Hospital records showed no delivery. No medical professionals could verify prenatal care or childbirth. The absence of medical documentation proved the pregnancy was fabricated. This proof was necessary to establish the motive for the kidnapping. The defense faced challenges arguing against the weight of evidence. Manukau Togiavalu entered a guilty plea, acknowledging responsibility for the kidnapping. Guilty pleas often occur when the evidence is overwhelming, and a trial would likely result in conviction with potentially harsher sentencing. By pleading guilty, defendants can sometimes negotiate for reduced sentences. Defense arguments may have focused on Manukau Togiavalu's mental state. False pregnancy claims can be associated with psychological conditions. The defense might have presented mental health evaluations suggesting Manukau Togiavalu experienced genuine delusions about being pregnant. But courts must balance mental health considerations against public safety and the seriousness of the crime. The guilty plea meant the case proceeded to sentencing without a full trial. The judge received victim impact statements, evidence of the crime's effects, and arguments from both prosecution and defense about appropriate punishment. The sentencing phase would determine what consequences Manukau Togiavalu would face for her actions. The court rejected arguments that minimized the severity of the crime. Some defendants in kidnapping cases argue that safe return of the victim reduces criminal responsibility. New Zealand law, like many areas, treats kidnapping seriously, no matter what the outcome. The crime occurs when the child is taken, not only if permanent harm results. The baby's father provided a victim impact statement that was read in Auckland District Court during Manukau Togiavalu's sentencing on July 2018. The New Zealand Herald reported the father described the 6-year struggle he and his wife endured to conceive a child. The couple had met as university sweethearts and spent years dealing with fertility challenges before finally achieving pregnancy. The pregnancy itself proved difficult, ending with the mother's heart rate dropping dangerously and requiring emergency caesarean section delivery. The parents hired Manukau Togiavalu exactly to help them recover from the traumatic birth and catch up on desperately needed sleep. New mothers recovering from caesarean sections face major physical limitations and pain during the healing process. Manukau Togiavalu had been with the family for only 3 days when she orchestrated the kidnapping. The father's statement described waking around 7 a.m. on August 9, 2017, to what he called a parent's worst nightmare. He came out of the bedroom to find the back door open and their precious baby missing from her cot. However, Manukau Togiavalu kept claiming she had no idea what had happened. But the father told the court he knew right away in his heart that something was wrong and Nadine was not telling the truth. The father described watching the CCTV footage minutes after discovering the baby missing. What he saw, he told Judge Nicola Mathers, was like watching something from a horror movie. The video showed a female wearing a balaclava, peering through their back window, then exiting through the same door carrying bags and the most precious thing in their lives. The security camera captured her using a remote control to open their gate, showing she had inside knowledge of how their property's security system operated. The 7 hours without their daughter were the worst of their entire lives, the father stated in court. The couple had trouble sleeping for months afterward as a result of the trauma. They did not trust many people with their child following the kidnapping. They required professional psychological help to cope with the ongoing effects. The father stressed that the kidnapping represented a a complete harm of trust. The family had invited Manukau Togiavalu into their home to care for their baby. They had trusted the nanny agency that found and recommended her. In return, they were plunged into hell for the longest 7 hours of our lives. There was nothing more reprehensible than what the two young women did, taking a defenseless 11-day-old baby from her parents, and throughout the ordeal, being able to end it at any time, but choosing instead to continue the charade that they knew nothing of her whereabouts. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Jacqueline Rakoff evaluated Manukau Togiavalu and diagnosed her with compulsive lying, a rare condition called pseudologia fantastica. Dr. Rakoff's evaluation: a rare psychiatric condition involving compulsive lying where patients represent fantasies as real occurrences. Dr. Rakoff's psychological assessment showed that Manukau Togiavalu's lying had an unconscious drive, rather than being purely manipulative behaviour. The psychiatrist noted that Manukau Togiavalu's fantasies consistently involved obtaining basic human needs like housing, shelter and food, rather than seeking fame or financial gain. The court heard evidence about Manukau Togiavalu's trauma history. In 2014, when she was 17 years old, she held her 15-year-old cousin Luke Tipponay in her arms as he bled to passing after being attacked with a weapon. She later said in court at the Taking a Life trial, stating, "He was my little cousin and I was supposed to look after him." A psychologist's report showed she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, experienced delusions, and had created an imaginary friend as a coping mechanism. Judge Mathers sentenced Manukau Togiavalu to 3 years imprisonment on July 2018 for kidnapping and burglary. She was also convicted and discharged on more charges, including criminal harassment, dishonestly using a document for financial gain, making an intimate visual recording. The judge stressed the seriousness of the months-long planning and the elaborate deception involved in the crime. The court offered Manukau Togiavalu a community corrections order that would have provided psychological counselling and support services while avoiding prison time. Court records show Manukau Togiavalu told her attorney to refuse the offer. She chose to receive the prison sentence rather than accept the community-based other option that included mental health treatment. The New Zealand court sentenced Nadine Faye Manukau Togiavalu to multiple years in prison. The exact term reflected the seriousness of kidnapping a newborn infant, the planning involved, and the abuse of trust. New Zealand's sentencing guidelines for kidnapping consider factors including victim weakness, planning ahead, and harm caused. The judge stressed the elaborate planning shown by the months-long false pregnancy deception. This was not an impulsive crime committed in a moment of poor judgment. Manukau Togiavalu had constructed an entire false narrative that required the theft of an actual baby to complete. The planning ahead warranted serious punishment. The sentence would need to reflect both the crime itself and the psychological manipulation that made it possible, through months of calculated deception. Victim impact evidence came from multiple sources. The father's detailed victim impact statement, reported extensively by the New Zealand Herald, documented how the kidnapping occurred during what should have been a joyous time for the new parents. They had spent 6 years trying to conceive. His statement revealed they met as university sweethearts and built their relationship while struggling with infertility. When they finally succeeded in getting pregnant, the pregnancy itself proved difficult and dangerous. The father's account describes how the mother's heart rate dropped dangerously during labour, requiring emergency intervention. The caesarean section delivery was traumatic. His statement details how they hired Manukau Togiavalu specifically to help with recovery from this difficult birth. They needed someone to help with childcare while the mother healed and both parents tried to catch up on desperately needed sleep. His testimony revealed she had been with them for only 3 days when the kidnapping occurred. The father described waking around 7 a.m. on August 9, 2017, to what he called a parent's worst nightmare. His statement describes he found the back door open and the baby missing from her cot. He immediately suspected Manukau Togiavalu, despite her denials. His testimony revealed he watched the security camera footage within minutes of discovering the baby gone. What he saw was like watching something from a horror movie. A figure in a balaclava peering through windows, then leaving with bags and their newborn baby. His statement documented the 7 hours without their daughter as the worst of their entire lives. The trauma didn't end when the baby was returned safely. His victim impact testimony revealed the couple had trouble sleeping for months afterward. They required professional psychological help to cope with the lasting effects. His statement detailed how they found it difficult to trust anyone with their child following the kidnapping. The infant's parents described the trauma of discovering their newborn was missing. They explained the fear they experienced, not knowing if their baby was safe, fed, or properly cared for. The hours of separation felt endless when their child's survival depended on someone who had stolen her. The emotional impact extended beyond the immediate kidnapping period. The parents lost the ability to trust easily. They would always carry the knowledge that someone they had allowed near their baby had taken advantage of that access to commit a serious crime. This loss of trust affected how they approached childcare and social relationships going forward. The victim impact also addressed the harm of the parent-child bond during an urgent period. Newborns form attachments through consistent care from their main caregivers. The abduction disrupted this bonding process during the most at-risk weeks of the child's life. While the baby was too young to remember the event consciously, the effects of separation during this developmental stage concerned medical professionals. The court highlighted that lack of physical harm does not lessen kidnapping severity. Manukau Togiavalu's crime was serious because she unlawfully took and restrained an infant, not because of any more abuse. The kidnapping itself made up the harm. The baby's safe recovery was fortunate, but did not excuse the original crime. Sentencing also considered the broader impact on community trust. New parents rely on help from others when caring for newborns. Cases like this one create fear that legitimate offers of assistance might mask criminal intent. The erosion of community trust represents harm beyond the immediate victim's family. The false pregnancy aspect received specific attention during sentencing. The sustained deception showed a level of manipulation and planning that made the crime more serious. Manukau Togiavalu had deliberately created circumstances that would enable her to take and claim someone else's baby. This calculated approach warranted stronger punishment than an opportunistic crime. The sentence needed to serve multiple purposes: punishment for the crime committed, deterrence for others who might consider similar actions, protection of the public during the prison time period. The court balanced these considerations when determining the appropriate term of imprisonment. The infant was safely returned to her family following the intervention by New Zealand police. The parents resumed care of their newborn, but the experience permanently altered their sense of security. Trust, once broken by such a betrayal, rebuilds slowly, if at all. Manukau Togiavalu became eligible for parole on September 1, 2018, after serving 1/3 of her sentence. She made her first parole application on May 2019. The New Zealand Parole Board declined to release her, citing concerns about not enough information regarding her risk level and treatment progress. The board's May 2019 decision noted that while she had been classified as a minimum security prisoner, she had several incidents while in prison, including one where she was involved in fighting with or assaulting another prisoner in January 2019. She had also been involved in an incident where she sprayed disinfectant toward a prison officer. The parole board requested a psychological assessment to evaluate her level of risk and the progress she had made while undertaking treatment programs. The board scheduled her next hearing for October 2019, giving prison psychologists time to complete the evaluation. Manukau Togiavalu appeared before the board again in October 2019. The board noted she had completed a rehabilitation program where she learned to identify high-risk situations in relationships and associates. But the board again declined to release her, expressing continuing concern about whether she posed an undue risk to community safety, especially to babies and young children. In September 2020, Manukau Togiavalu made her third appearance before the parole board. At this hearing, the board granted her parole with release scheduled for December 2020. Her parole included special conditions including GPS monitoring and a prohibition against entering Auckland, where the kidnapping had occurred. The parole period extended until August 30th, 2020, when her full sentence would officially end. When the New Zealand Herald informed the parents of Manukau Togiavalu's impending release in 2020, they told the newspaper they were massively disappointed. The father stated he still considered Manukau Togiavalu to be clearly a danger to the community, especially babies and young children. The family wished to warn other parents about her release and expressed frustration that she would soon be free, despite the lasting and considerable damage she had caused. They described the kidnapping as a living nightmare that continued to affect their family years after the crime occurred. The parents told the media they were disturbed and disappointed with Manukau Togiavalu's parole. They questioned how someone who had meticulously planned to kidnap a newborn deceived multiple people and institutions, shown no genuine remorse, could be considered safe to release after serving only about 2 years of a 3-year sentence. Their concerns focused on protecting other families from experiencing similar trauma. The case prompted widespread discussion in New Zealand about caregiver vetting and the warning signs of false pregnancy claims. Parenting groups and child safety organisations examined the case to identify lessons for protecting other families. The elaborate nature of Manukau Togiavalu's deception made prevention challenging. The baby who was stolen to resolve a lie would grow up never remembering the crime, while her parents would never forget those hours of not knowing if they would see her again. False pregnancy, known medically as fake pregnancy, known medically as pseudocyesis, can involve genuine psychological conditions where people believe they are pregnant despite no physical pregnancy existing. But the legal system distinguishes between experiencing a delusion and acting criminally based on that delusion. Manukau Togiavalu's sustained deception over months suggested awareness and planning rather than pure delusion. Mental health professionals following the case noted that false pregnancy kidnappings follow a pattern. The kidnapper fabricates pregnancy, creates expectations among friends and family, and then faces a crisis when unable to produce a baby. The crime solves the immediate problem of maintaining the lie, but creates far more serious legal and moral consequences. The case appeared in New Zealand parole board decisions, showing Manukau Togiavalu would eventually become eligible for parole review. The parole process in New Zealand requires prisoners to demonstrate rehabilitation and reduced risk to public safety before release. For someone who committed such a planned and serious crime, the parole board would need large evidence of change before considering release. Victims' rights in New Zealand include notification when offenders become eligible for parole. The infant's family would have the opportunity to provide input during parole hearings. Their perspective on the ongoing impact of the crime would be considered when evaluating whether Manukau Togiavalu posed continued risk. This remains frequently cited in analyses of caregiver-motivated abduction. Criminologists and child safety experts reference it when discussing how emotional narratives can enable criminals to bypass rational safeguards. The months of false pregnancy claims created a psychological and social context that made the actual kidnapping easier to execute. Education efforts following the case focused on recognizing warning signs of fabricated pregnancies. While not all false pregnancy claims lead to kidnapping, the pattern of someone claiming pregnancy without medical verification and then seeking access to others' infants warrants caution. Communities learn to balance trust with appropriate verification. The infant's long-term welfare remains private, protected by New Zealand's strong privacy laws regarding minors. The child would grow up without conscious memory of the kidnapping, due to her age at the time. But the parents would need to decide when and how to explain what happened as the child matured. The events reinforced how dangerous deception becomes when combined with caregiver access. Manukau Togiavalu's ability to maintain an elaborate lie for months showed planning capacity that translated into effective crime execution. Trust, while necessary for social function, creates vulnerabilities that determined criminals can exploit. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. If this story disturbs you as much as it does us, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us keep investigating cases that most channels ignore. Unlike Nadine Manukau Togiavalu, who enlisted her cousin to physically steal the baby, the next babysitter we're covering acted alone and left investigators with more questions than answers about why she did it. Case number 3, Nadeja Hill. Short-term babysitting arrangements carry risks that parents often underestimate. When someone is hired to watch an infant for a few hours, the level of scrutiny may be less intense than for long-term nanny positions. The babysitter arrives, cares for the child, and leaves. The transaction seems straightforward. This apparent simplicity can mask danger. In 2018, a New Jersey family hired Nadeja Hill, then 22 years old per CBS Philadelphia, to babysit their 4-month-old son. The arrangement appeared routine. Hill arrived to care for the infant while the mother handled other responsibilities. Then Hill stopped responding to messages. Hours passed without contact, but the mother could not reach her babysitter or her baby. The disappearance triggered an immediate police response. Authorities in Camden, New Jersey, issued alerts for the missing infant and the babysitter last seen with him. Investigators tracked Hill's movement from Camden to Newark. They found her on a train, still with the baby. The child was recovered safely, but the incident qualified legally as kidnapping. The babysitter, who was supposed to return a 4-month-old after a few hours, would instead take him on a journey that ended with her arrest and the baby's rescue. The events show how quickly trust in short-term childcare can be harmed. Hill was not a long-term employee with months of established reliability. She was a temporary babysitter hired for a specific period. The family had limited information about her background beyond what she had presented. This minimal relationship did not prevent her from accessing and taking their infant. The 4-month-old was too young to signal distress or resist being taken. Infant victims of kidnapping face specific weakness due to their complete dependence on adults for survival. The baby needed feeding, diaper changes, and appropriate care throughout the ordeal. The mother could not ensure these needs were met while her son was with Hill. Adagio Hill was hired by the infant's mother to provide babysitting services. The nature of their relationship was professional and transactional. Hill was not a family friend or relative. She was paid childcare help engaged for a specific time period. This type of arrangement is common when parents need temporary coverage. The family granted Hill direct, unsupervised access to their 4-month-old son. This level of trust is inherent in babysitting relationships. Parents cannot monitor caregivers constantly without defeating the purpose of hiring help. They must trust that the babysitter will provide appropriate care and return the child as agreed. The mother who hired a babysitter for a few hours had no way of knowing those hours would become a nightmare of unanswered calls and desperate searches. No record before criminal history linked Hill to child-related offences at the time of hire. Background checks, if conducted, would not have shown warning signs specific to kidnapping risk. Hill presented as a standard babysitter seeking employment. Nothing in her known background suggested she would abduct the child in her care. No before police involvement existed between Hill and this specific family. They were not resolving ongoing disputes or conflicts. The babysitting arrangement was their first major interaction. This absence of history meant the family had no previous experience with Hill's behaviour or reliability. The relationship between Hill and the family was limited to childcare transactions. They knew her professionally, not personally. This boundary is typical for babysitter family dynamics. Parents hire help without necessarily knowing details about the caregiver's life outside working hours. This professional distance means warning signs in the caregiver's personal life might not be visible to the family. No reports of before conflict or concerning behaviour preceded the kidnapping. Hill had not made threatening statements or showed instability that the family observed. The babysitting shift began normally, without red flags that would have prompted the mother to reconsider the arrangement. The 4-month-old infant could not say about Hill's behaviour or any concerns. At that age, babies cannot report if something feels wrong or if they are uncomfortable with a caregiver. Parents rely entirely on their judgment of the adult's character and trustworthiness. The infant's inability to provide information made the mother's decision to trust Hill completely about ensuring the babysitter was appropriate. The transactional nature of the relationship meant the family invested trust based on Hill's presentation, rather than long-term observation. They needed childcare help. Hill offered that help. The arrangement began without the months of relationship building that might characterize nanny employment. This quick trust setting up is both necessary for babysitting to function and potentially risky if the caregiver has criminal intent. The babysitting shift started without apparent irregularity. Adagio Hill arrived as scheduled to care for the 4-month-old infant. The mother provided necessary information about the baby's routine, feeding schedule, and any specific needs. These instructions are standard when leaving a young infant with a caregiver. Hill appeared to understand and accept her responsibilities. At some point after the mother's departure, communication broke down. The mother attempted to contact Hill through calls and messages. Babysitters typically remain responsive to parent check-ins, especially when caring for very young infants. Parents need reassurance that everything is proceeding smoothly. Hill's failure to respond right away created concern. The moment a babysitter stopped answering calls marked the point when routine childcare transformed into a parent's worst fear. As time passed without response, the mother's concern increased to alarm. First attempts to reach Hill might have been dismissed as the phone being temporarily unavailable or Hill being occupied with the baby, but prolonged silence without explanation exceeded reasonable explanations. But the mother could not confirm her son's well-being or whereabouts. The mother's growing panic reflected every parent's nightmare when they cannot reach their child or the person responsible for their care. Infants require constant attention and periodic feeding. A 4-month-old cannot wait indefinitely for care. The longer Hill remained unreachable, the more urgent the situation became from both safety and legal perspectives. The family realized the infant was missing while under Hill's care. This recognition prompted immediate action. The mother understood she was no longer dealing with a miscommunication, but with a genuine emergency. But her son was somewhere with a babysitter who was not responding and not returning the child as agreed. No ransom demand accompanied the disappearance. Hill did not contact the family to make threats or demands. The silence was complete. This absence of communication made the situation more confusing and frightening. The mother could not determine Hill's intentions or state of mind. Not knowing whether this was kidnapping, some kind of emergency, or another explanation, intensified the emotional damage. No before threats or warning signs had shown Hill might abduct the baby. The disappearance appeared to occur without warning. This unpredictability made the crime especially unsettling. If no observable red flags preceded the kidnapping, how could parents protect their children when hiring babysitters? The mother contacted police when the situation clearly exceeded a misunderstanding. Law enforcement treats missing infant cases with maximum urgency. Officers began gathering information about when Hill was last seen with the baby, what she was wearing, and any identifying information that could help locate them quickly. The build-up to discovery involved the family experiencing acute distress, while authorities mobilized resources. Every minute without confirmation of the baby's safety felt endless. The mother had to wait while police investigated, unable to personally search for her son effectively. The helplessness of depending on others to find her child compounded the trauma. Nadajia Hill took the 4-month-old infant without parental consent. The act harmed both the babysitting agreement and the law. She was entrusted with temporary care, not permission to remove the child from the family's control or travel to different locations without notification or approval. Police reports cited by NBC Philadelphia document Hill travelled from Camden to Newark with the baby. This movement across city boundaries showed clear intent to remove the infant from his home area. The distance between Camden and Newark is not trivial. The travel required active decisions and effort, distinguishing this from a simple failure to return on time. A babysitter crossed city lines with someone else's infant, transforming a childcare arrangement into a kidnapping that would mobilise police across 2 municipalities. The baby remained with Hill for several hours. During this time, the infant was separated from his mother without any means of reuniting. The 4-month-old depended entirely on Hill for feeding, diaper changes, and physical care. The mother could not ensure her son was receiving appropriate attention to his needs. The child was not physically harmed during the ordeal. Medical evaluation after recovery confirmed no injuries, but the absence of physical abuse does not eliminate the crime of kidnapping. The unlawful restraint and removal of the infant made up the criminal act, no matter what or whether Hill provided enough physical care during the abduction period. Hill was eventually located on a train while still in control of the infant. The train setting showed continued movement rather than stationary hiding, but she was not attempting to conceal the baby in a fixed location. The mobility suggested either flight or aimless travel. The motivations behind her actions remained unclear to investigators, beyond the basic fact of unlawful removal. The kidnapping relied on Hill's existing caregiver access, rather than force or deception at the point of taking. But she did not need to break into the home or physically overpower anyone. She was granted legitimate access through the babysitting arrangement. The crime occurred when she harmed the terms of that access by removing the infant without permission and failing to return him. The act met the legal definition of kidnapping under New Jersey law. Kidnapping involves unlawfully removing or restraining a person. The victim's age intensified the seriousness. 4-month-old infants are completely at risk and dependent. Hill's position as trusted babysitter made the betrayal more egregious from both legal and moral perspectives. The case showed how infant kidnappings can occur without harm when the kidnapper already has lawful access. Hill did not need to snatch the baby from a stroller or break into a home. She simply failed to return the child she was being paid to watch. The betrayal of basic babysitting obligations transformed routine childcare into a serious felony. The interstate travel component potentially added federal considerations to the case. Meanwhile, while Camden and Newark are both in New Jersey, the cross-jurisdiction movement complicated the investigation and required coordination between police departments. If Hill had crossed state lines, federal kidnapping laws might have applied, carrying even more severe penalties. The infant's mother reported her son missing to Camden police right away upon recognizing the situation exceeded acceptable babysitter unresponsiveness. Officers started a missing child investigation with the urgency appropriate to an infant case. Every moment matters when a baby is unaccounted for and potentially in danger. Camden Police issued alerts through multiple channels. Local law enforcement, transit authorities, and neighbouring areas received information about the missing 4-month-old and the babysitter last seen with him. The alerts included descriptions of Hill and the infant to help officers and civilians identify them if spotted. Police alerts went out across New Jersey transit systems, turning what started as a babysitting arrangement in Camden into a multi-agency manhunt that would end on a Newark train. Investigators right away identified Hill as the person of main interest. She was the last individual known to have custody of the baby. The mother provided Hill's contact information and physical description. Officers attempted to reach Hill directly, while simultaneously beginning physical search efforts. The investigation focused on tracking Hill's movements from Camden. Detectives reviewed available surveillance footage from the area where the babysitting occurred. Transit records and camera systems helped establish that Hill had travelled toward Newark with the infant. This information allowed police to narrow their search area and coordinate with Newark authorities. The cross-jurisdictional nature of the case required cooperation between Camden and Newark police departments. Law enforcement agencies shared information and resources to locate Hill and the baby as quickly as possible. The coordinated effort showed how modern policing handles cases where suspects cross municipal boundaries. Transit police became crucial to the investigation when it was determined Hill was using trains. Train systems maintain security cameras and have officers monitoring stations and trains. The focused search on transit infrastructure proved effective when Hill was spotted with the infant on a train. Law enforcement reported officers located Hill while she was still in control of the baby. The recovery operation prioritized the infant's safety. However, police needed to ensure Hill could not harm the child during apprehension. Training for such situations stresses protecting the victim while securing the suspect. The baby was right away separated from Hill and assessed by emergency medical personnel. The evaluation confirmed the 4-month-old had not suffered physical injuries. Medical professionals checked for signs of neglect, dehydration, or other health concerns that might have developed during the hours of abduction. The infant's physical health was stable. Hill was taken into custody at the scene. She faced immediate arrest on suspicion of kidnapping. The evidence was clear. She had taken the infant without permission, travelled to another city, and failed to return the baby or respond to the mother's attempts at contact. These facts established probable cause for kidnapping charges. The infant was reunited with his mother as quickly as possible after medical clearance. The reunion was emotionally intense. The mother had spent hours not knowing if her son was safe. The relief of holding her baby again mixed with the trauma of the experience and anger at Hill's betrayal of trust. Camden, New Jersey, where the kidnapping originated, is a city across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. The city faces major economic challenges and has struggled with crime rates above national averages. But most crimes in Camden involve property theft, drug offences, or harm between adults who know each other. Cases like Hill's kidnapping of an infant she was hired to care for remain statistically rare and especially shocking when they occur. The New Jersey transit system connects Camden to Newark and other cities throughout the state. The River Line, where Hill was in the end located with the baby, is a light rail system that runs between Camden and Trenton, passing through multiple municipalities in southern New Jersey. Transit authorities provided crucial assistance to police by accessing electronic fare records and surveillance footage that helped track Hill's movements throughout her journey with the infant. Camden County Police coordinated with New Jersey Transit Police and Burlington County authorities when Hill crossed municipal boundaries. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the search showed how even a kidnapping covering a relatively short geographic area required cooperation between multiple law enforcement agencies. Officers distributed information about Hill and the infant to train operators and station personnel throughout the transit system. CBS Philadelphia reported the baby was recovered after 12:30 p.m. on Saturday in Riverside Township, Burlington County. The timing meant the infant had been missing for somewhere between 12 and 18 hours, depending on when the mother first became unable to contact Hill. Medical personnel evaluated the 4-month-old right away after recovery and found him to be in good health despite the ordeal. Investigators conducted interviews with Hill to understand her motivations and timeline. What had prompted her to take the infant and travel to Newark? Had she planned this in advance or acted impulsively? The answers to these questions would be relevant to prosecution and sentencing. But no matter what the motive, the crime itself was established by her actions. Evidence collection included documentation of the timeline, witness statements from the mother and anyone else who had contact with Hill that day, transit records showing her travel, medical evaluations of the infant. This evidence package would support prosecution efforts. The Dargia Hill was arrested and charged with kidnapping and child endangerment. The charges reflected both the unlawful removal of the infant and the risks she created by taking a 4-month-old across cities without parental knowledge or consent. The kidnapping charge under New Jersey law required proof that Hill unlawfully removed or restrained the infant. The evidence clearly established these elements. She failed to return the child or respond to the mother's contact attempts. She maintained custody of the infant for hours beyond the agreed babysitting period. The prosecution would argue that a babysitter who stops answering calls and takes an infant to another city has committed kidnapping no matter what, or whether she eventually intended to return the child. The child endangerment charge addressed the risks Hill created for the 4-month-old's welfare. Infants require specialized care at regular intervals. By removing the baby from his mother's control and becoming unreachable, Hill placed the infant in danger no matter what, or whether she provided enough immediate care. The mother could not ensure her son's needs were being met. Prosecutors stressed the abuse of babysitter trust in their case presentation. Hill had been hired to provide care for specific hours in a specific location. Parents who hire babysitters must trust that their children will be safe and returned as agreed. Hill harmed this basic expectation. The betrayal made her crime more serious from a legal and societal perspective. Court proceedings focused on the unlawful removal, rather than speculation about Hill's final intentions. Whether she planned to permanently keep the baby or simply acted irrationally for a period was less important than the fact that she committed kidnapping by taking him without consent and restraining him for hours. The prosecution did not need to prove Hill intended to harm the infant. Kidnapping law addresses the act of unlawful removal and restraint. Physical harm to the victim, while it would worsen the crime if present, is not required for kidnapping charges. The crime occurs when the child is taken without authorization. Bail and being held proceedings followed the New Jersey criminal process. Kidnapping charges typically result in large bail amounts due to the crime's severity. Court records show the courts considered flight risk, danger to the community, and the nature of the offence when determining whether Hill would remain in custody pending trial or be released under conditions. Defence attorneys in such cases often argue for reduced charges or sentencing based on factors like lack of before criminal history, absence of physical harm to the victim, or reducing circumstances in the defendant's personal life. But the evidence against Hill was strong. She was found with the infant in Newark after travelling from Camden without permission. The prosecution moved forward through pre-trial motions and hearings. Defence and prosecution exchanged evidence and legal arguments. The strength of the prosecution's case likely influenced any plea negotiations. When evidence clearly establishes guilt, defendants often plead guilty in exchange for sentencing recommendations, rather than risk conviction at trial, with potentially harsher penalties. Court records show the court considered the emotional trauma inflicted on the infant's mother during sentencing proceedings. The hours she spent unable to reach Hill or confirm her son's safety created lasting psychological impact. Parents who experience their child being kidnapped often develop heightened anxiety and difficulty trusting caregivers later. Victim impact evidence stressed the specific weakness of the 4-month-old victim. Infants cannot protect themselves or seek help. They depend entirely on adults for survival. However, Hill's removal of the baby placed him in a position where his basic needs might not be met, and where the mother could not ensure his safety. The courtroom would determine appropriate punishment for a woman who transformed a few hours of babysitting into a cross-city kidnapping that traumatized a mother and endangered an infant. The victim impact statements likely addressed the lasting effects on the family's sense of security. The mother would carry the memory of those terrifying hours whenever she needed to hire childcare in the future. Trust, once harmed in this basic way, becomes difficult to extend again. The crime's impact would persist long after the immediate event. The court reinforced that kidnapping severity is not diminished by safe recovery of the victim. However, Hill's decision to not physically harm the infant did not erase the crime she committed. The safe eventual recovery was fortunate, but did not reduce her criminal liability. The case highlighted how duration does not negate kidnapping once the elements are satisfied. Even though the abduction lasted hours rather than days, it made up a serious crime. The law protects children from unlawful removal, no matter how long the removal lasts. Parents have the right to control who has custody of their children and for what duration. The sentence imposed on Hill reflected New Jersey's approach to kidnapping cases involving infant victims. The penalties for child kidnapping are severe because children are especially at risk and parents' rights to custody must be protected. Hill's abuse of her position as trusted babysitter likely influenced sentencing considerations. Child endangerment charges added to the overall consequences Hill faced. The court recognized that taking a 4-month-old infant away from his mother without ensuring proper care arrangements created risk to the child's welfare. Even if Hill provided enough immediate physical care, the situation itself was inherently dangerous to an infant's well-being. The sentencing served multiple purposes: punishing Hill for her crime, deterring others from similar actions, and protecting the public during any prison time period. The court balanced these considerations when determining appropriate consequences for someone who had harmed the most basic trust parents must place in hired caregivers. The 4-month-old infant was reunited with his family following Hill's arrest. The mother resumed full-time care of her son, but the experience permanently altered her approach to childcare arrangements. The ease with which a babysitter had taken her baby would influence her decisions about who to trust with her child going forward. Hill's employment as a babysitter ended right away. No possibility existed for her to continue working in childcare after kidnapping the infant in her care. The criminal charges and eventual conviction would likely prevent her from obtaining similar employment in the future. Background checks in the childcare industry flag kidnapping convictions. The baby who was too young to remember being taken would grow up safe, while his mother would always remember the hours of terror that came from trusting the wrong babysitter. Legal proceedings were cited in discussions about caregiver screening and emergency protocols. Parents and childcare experts examined what could have prevented the situation or shortened the ordeal. Questions arose about how long parents should wait before calling police when babysitters become unresponsive. The incident reinforced that infant kidnappings can occur without harm when access already exists through childcare arrangements. Hill did not need to break into a home or overcome physical barriers. She was granted access through the babysitting relationship. The crime occurred through betrayal rather than force. Emergency protocols for babysitter unresponsiveness became a topic of discussion in parenting communities. How many unanswered calls should trigger police contact? What level of delay exceeds reasonable explanation? Parents should trust their instincts when something feels wrong about a babysitter's silence. The mother's experience highlighted the helplessness parents feel when they cannot locate their children. She had to wait while police investigated rather than being able to search effectively herself. This forced passivity during a crisis adds to the emotional damage. Parents want to act to protect their children, but in kidnapping situations, they often must defer to law enforcement. The safe recovery of the infant prevented the worst possible outcome. Many child abduction cases end tragically. The fact that Hill was located while the baby was still in her control and unharmed represented the best resolution to a terrible situation. But the trauma to the family persisted, despite the positive ending. The situation remains instructive about the risks inherent in short-term babysitting arrangements. Parents necessarily extend trust to caregivers they may not know well. While most babysitters fulfill their responsibilities appropriately, cases like Hill's demonstrate that danger can come from hired help. No screening process can eliminate all risk when granting strangers access to children. The infant's long-term well-being depends partly on how the family processes and recovers from the trauma. The baby was too young to have a conscious memory of the kidnapping, but the mother's ongoing anxiety or hypervigilance could affect the child's sense of security as he grows. Families who experience such crimes often benefit from counselling to address lasting psychological effects. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. Support our work by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. These investigations take time, and your engagement helps us continue. While Nadaja Hill's kidnapping lasted hours on a train ride through New Jersey, the next woman we're covering spent over a decade creating false identities and targeting multiple families before authorities finally stopped her. Case number 4. Samantha Azzopardi. Serial deception enables serial crimes. When someone repeatedly fabricates identities and backstories, each lie creates opportunity for exploitation. The BBC and ABC News Australia reported Samantha Azzopardi operated across the United Kingdom and Ireland between 2014 and 2015, weaponising perceived legitimacy to abduct multiple children. But she did not use force. She did not break into homes. She simply presented herself as someone with authority to take children, and they went with her. Azzopardi's pattern involved targeting public spaces where children gathered: parks, shopping centres, schools. She selected moments when adult attention was divided or temporarily focused elsewhere. She approached children with calm confidence, using language that suggested she had permission or responsibility. The children complied because they believed she was authorized to take them. The crimes spanned multiple areas, complicating investigation and prosecution. Each abduction lasted hours to days. The children were eventually recovered, unharmed physically, but the psychological impact on the victims and their families was major. Trust in public safety eroded when a stranger could simply walk away with children by claiming legitimacy. A woman with a recorded history of identity fraud would transform herself repeatedly into whatever role allowed her to take other people's children. Azzopardi's background included large identity fraud and fabricated personal histories. She frequently posed as a nanny, a family friend, or an at-risk person needing help. These identities gained her access to situations where children were present. Once positioned appropriately, she could execute abductions that relied entirely on social engineering rather than physical force. The evidence reveals how authority projection can override children's natural wariness of strangers. Parents teach children not to go with people they do not know. But when someone appears official or uses confident language suggesting parental permission, children's training becomes ineffective. Azzopardi took advantage of this weakness systematically. Her eventual arrest in Dublin with an abducted child linked multiple incidents across borders. CCTV footage showed patterns in her approach and targeting. The cross-border nature of her crimes required international cooperation for complete investigation and prosecution. Samantha Azzopardi had a recorded history of identity fraud before the child abduction cases. She did not suddenly begin fabricating identities when she started targeting children. The pattern of deception was established and long-standing. This history should have made her actions more predictable to authorities, yet she continued operating across regions. She frequently posed as a nanny or childcare worker. This fabricated role provided cover for her interest in children and access to locations where they were present. By claiming professional involvement with childcare, she appeared legitimate when seen with children. The nanny identity was strategic rather than coincidental. Azzopardi didn't need a real job working with children when she could simply claim to be a nanny and use that lie to access victims. Azzopardi also posed as a family friend or helpful adult in various situations. The specific identity she adopted depended on the circumstances and what would be most effective for gaining trust. Her ability to quickly assess situations and select appropriate personas showed practiced social manipulation skills. She sometimes presented herself as an at-risk person needing assistance. This approach reversed the typical power dynamic, making her seem harmless rather than threatening. People who believed they were helping her were less likely to question her actions or presence. The weakness pose was itself a manipulation tactic. No legitimate employment relationship existed between Azzopardi and the victims' families. She was not hired as a babysitter or nanny by any of the families whose children she abducted. Her connection to the victims came through deception and opportunistic targeting, rather than formal arrangements. Azzopardi gained trust through calm demeanor and authority projection. She spoke confidently and behaved as though she had every right to interact with or take children. This projected confidence made observers less likely to intervene. People assume adults with children have legitimate relationships, unless something obviously signals danger. Her targeting strategy focused on public places where supervision might be temporarily reduced. Parks offer many locations where children play while parents watch from a distance. Shopping centres create situations where adults are briefly distracted by transactions or navigation. Schools involve trusted transitions between adult authorities. Azzopardi identified these weakness points systematically. The pattern of identity fabrication extended beyond just claiming to be a nanny. Medical records investigators discovered false identities, fabricated nationalities, and invented personal histories throughout Azzopardi's interactions with authorities and social services. The pervasive deception suggested possible psychological conditions involving identity disturbance, though diagnoses were not fully public. Azzopardi's ability to maintain calm under questioning and sustain false identities for extended periods showed practice. These were not spontaneous lies told under pressure. She could inhabit fabricated identities convincingly, answering questions and providing details that made her stories believable to people without reason to be suspicious. Samantha Azzopardi's crimes required identifying suitable locations where children would be accessible and where her presence would not right away seem suspicious. Public parks met these criteria. Children play in parks with varying levels of adult supervision. A woman watching or approaching children in a park does not instantly trigger alarm unless her behaviour is overtly threatening. Shopping centres provided another hunting ground. Parents navigate stores with children, sometimes becoming distracted by purchases or managing multiple children at once. The busy environment creates moments where a child might be slightly separated from their guardian, as a party could approach during these brief windows. Every public space where parents momentarily divided their attention became a hunting ground for someone who understood exactly how to exploit split-second vulnerabilities. Schools involved trusted transitions between adult authorities. Parents dropped children off expecting teachers or staff to assume supervision, as a party could position herself during these handoff moments, using confident language, suggesting she was there to collect a specific child on behalf of the parents. The authority implied by her demeanour made questioning less likely. Azzopardi targeted moments of adult distraction with precision. She did not approach children when parents were watching closely. She waited for opportunities when attention was elsewhere. Parents cannot maintain constant eyes-on supervision in all public settings. Azzopardi took advantage of the normal lapses that occur when adults multitask or trust their environment. She used confident language that suggested permission or authority. Statements like, "Your mum asked me to take you home," or "I'm here to collect you," position the adult as acting with parental approval. Children, trained to obey adults and accustomed to various relatives or family friends taking part in their care, often comply with such statements rather than questioning them. The selection process involved assessing which children would be most at risk to this approach. Very young children might not comply or might cry right away, drawing attention. Older children might question the stranger more assertively. Azzopardi targeted ages where children understood adult authority, but had not yet developed strong, stranger danger reflexes that would override an authoritative adult's claims. Her calm demeanour was crucial to the crime's success. If she had appeared nervous or rushed, observers might have noticed and intervened. Instead, she behaved as though taking the child was completely normal and expected. This confidence made the situation appear legitimate to anyone glancing at the interaction. CCTV footage later analysed by police showed her approach patterns. She observed potential victims before approaching. She waited for optimal moments when parents were least attentive. She made physical contact in ways that appeared guiding rather than forceful. The children walked with her rather than being dragged or carried, which would have been obvious cause for alarm. The build-up also involved Azzopardi moving between regions. After committing abductions in one area, she would relocate to another area. This geographic spread delayed recognition of a pattern. Local police might investigate an individual incident without right away connecting it to similar crimes in neighbouring regions. The cross-border operation allowed her to continue longer than she might have if operating in one location. Samantha Azzopardi's abductions were executed through social engineering rather than physical force. The children she targeted were walked away from safe locations, not grabbed or carried against obvious resistance. They went with her because her behaviour suggested legitimacy and authority. This non-harmful approach made the crimes more difficult to detect at the moment. The children complied because they believed Azzopardi was authorised to take them. She may have claimed to be sent by their parents, to be a relative they had not met, or to have official reason for collecting them. Whatever specific story she told in each case, the narrative convinced the children that going with her was expected and safe. Children walked willingly into abduction because a stranger spoke with enough confidence to make them believe their parents had sent her. The abductions lasted from hours to days, depending on the specific incident. During these periods, the children were separated from their families without contact. The parents experienced the trauma of having their children missing without knowing their location or condition. The uncertainty was agonising no matter what or how each case eventually resolved. No physical injuries were reported to the children. Azzopardi did not abuse or harm the victims physically during the abduction periods, but the absence of physical harm does not eliminate the crime's severity or its psychological impact. The children experienced fear, confusion, and separation from their families. These emotional harms can be long-lasting, even without physical injury. The crimes relied entirely on Azzopardi's ability to project authority and legitimacy, but she did not need weapons or physical strength. She needed convincing lies and confident delivery. This shows how social manipulation can be as effective as force for committing certain crimes, especially those involving children who are taught to obey adults. Each abduction had unique details, but the pattern was consistent. Public location, moment of reduced supervision, confident approach with authoritative language, child compliance. Prolonged separation before discovery. The pattern's consistency suggests Azzopardi had refined her method through practice, making each later crime easier to execute. The abductions caused immediate crises for the families. Parents reported their children missing to police. Search efforts mobilized across communities. Media appeals went out with children's descriptions and photographs. The public response to missing children cases is urgent and emotional. Azzopardi created these crises repeatedly through her serial offending. The children, once recovered, had to process experiences that were traumatic despite the absence of physical abuse. Being taken by a stranger, separated from family, and kept in unfamiliar locations creates fear and confusion. Younger victims might not fully understand what happened, but the experience could still affect their sense of security and trust. Parents reported their children missing when they discovered the abductions. The first investigations focused on finding the missing children as quickly as possible. Officers gathered information about when and where the children were last seen, what they were wearing, and who they had been with. CCTV footage became crucial evidence linking multiple incidents to Azzopardi. Cameras in public spaces captured her approaching children, the children leaving with her, and her travelling with victims. Video evidence showed consistent patterns in her behaviour and appearance across different abductions. This footage helped investigators connect cases that at first seemed unrelated. Security cameras across multiple cities gradually showed a pattern that would identify one woman as responsible for serial child abductions, spanning international borders. The cross-border pattern emerged as police departments compared cases. The same description appeared in reports from different areas. The same methods were used across regions. Investigators began to suspect they were dealing with a serial offender rather than isolated incidents. This recognition led to cooperation between law enforcement agencies in sharing information and coordinating investigation efforts. Azzopardi was eventually arrested in Dublin with an abducted child. Irish police apprehended her while she had custody of a victim. The arrest in the act provided clear evidence of at least one abduction. Investigators then worked to connect her to earlier cases through CCTV footage, witness statements, and her pattern of fabricated identities. The investigation showed Azzopardi's history of identity fraud and deception. Her pattern of lying about who she was extended far beyond the child abduction cases. This broader pattern of deception helped explain how she had evaded detection for so long. She could adopt new identities and move to new locations, making it difficult for any single area to track her effectively. Samantha Azzopardi's criminal history spanned multiple countries and involved repeated acts of identity fraud combined with child abduction. Australian news sources including the ABC and BBC reported Azzopardi had been arrested multiple times across different areas for similar offences. Her pattern involved approaching at-risk individuals, fabricating elaborate backstories about her identity and circumstances, then abducting children through deception rather than force. Court documents showed that Azzopardi frequently posed as various personas, including a Russian gymnast, a victim of human trafficking, at different times claimed to be of various nationalities. She spoke with fake accents to support her fabricated identities. The variety and complexity of her deceptions showed sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate social services and law enforcement across different countries. In Dublin, Ireland, where she was eventually arrested with an abducted child, Azzopardi had been posing as a teenager in need of protection. Irish authorities placed her in emergency accommodation, believing she was an at-risk minor. She used this cover to access and abduct a child before police identified her true identity and arrested her. The Dublin case led to her conviction and imprisonment in Ireland. Azzopardi's case became notable in Australia when she was sentenced in 2021 for child stealing offences committed there. The Sydney Morning Herald and ABC News widely covered her sentencing, emphasising how she had targeted multiple children over years. The Sydney Morning Herald documented her ability to evade detection across international borders, made her especially dangerous and difficult for any single area to track comprehensively. Interviewing Azzopardi proved challenging due to her propensity for fabrication. She provided false information even when confronted with evidence, but her statements could not be trusted at face value. Investigators had to rely on physical evidence, witness statements in court, and documentation rather than her cooperation. The children were recovered safely in physical terms. Medical examinations confirmed no physical injuries, but psychological evaluations recognized that the abductions had traumatic effects, despite the absence of physical abuse. The recovery process involved reuniting children with families and providing appropriate support services. Samantha Azzopardi faced multiple counts of child abduction across different areas. The charges reflected each separate incident where she had unlawfully taken a child. Serial offending typically results in multiple charges being prosecuted together or sequentially, depending on the legal system's processes. Prosecutors built cases around the evidence of systematic targeting and abduction of children. CCTV footage showing her approaching and leaving with victims was compelling evidence. Witness statements from parents and others who had seen her with missing children added context. The pattern of behaviour across cases showed intent and method. The prosecution would need to prove not just individual abductions, but a pattern of calculated child theft that spanned cities and relied on masterful deception. Psychological evaluations were conducted to assess Azzopardi's mental state and competency. Serial identity fabrication and the specific pattern of child abduction raised questions about potential psychological conditions, but mental health issues, if identified, would need to be balanced against public safety concerns and the seriousness of her crimes. Azzopardi pleaded guilty to the charges against her. Guilty pleas avoid trial and can result in reduced sentences through plea agreements. By admitting responsibility, she made the trial unnecessary. The legal process moved directly to sentencing considerations after the guilty plea was entered. The guilty plea simplified proceedings but raised questions about her motivations that would never be fully answered. Why did she systematically target children? What did she intend to do with them? Her unwillingness or inability to provide honest explanations left these questions unresolved. The legal system focused on what she did rather than why, since the acts themselves were clearly established. Defense arguments likely focused on mental health considerations and the absence of physical harm to victims. Defense attorneys in such cases attempt to mitigate sentencing by emphasizing any factors that make the defendant less culpable or dangerous than the crimes might suggest. But the serial nature of the offending and the systematic targeting of at-risk children limited how effectively these arguments could reduce consequences. The court heard victim impact evidence from multiple families. Each family described the trauma of having their child taken, the hours or days of terror before recovery, and the lasting effects on their children's sense of security. The collective impact across multiple victims showed the large harm Azzopardi had caused through her serial offending. The multiple areas involved complicated proceedings. Charges filed in different locations had to be coordinated. Azzopardi needed to answer for crimes in each area where she had offended. The legal systems in the UK and Ireland worked together to ensure complete prosecution. Samantha Azzopardi was sentenced to prison, with terms varying by area where she was prosecuted. Child abduction carries serious penalties in both the UK and Ireland. The serial nature of her offending and the pattern of deliberate targeting likely influenced sentencing decisions toward the upper ranges of possible punishment. Families who had experienced the abduction of their children provided victim impact statements. These statements described the immediate terror of discovering their child was missing, the agonizing hours of not knowing if the child was safe, the lasting psychological effects on both the children and their families. The courtroom heard from multiple families whose trust in public safety had been shattered by a stranger who could walk away with their children simply by claiming authority. The lasting fear in public spaces became a common theme in victim impact statements. Parents described their inability to relax in parks, shopping centres, or other locations where their children had been taken. At this point, the spaces that should have been safe for family activities now triggered anxiety and hypervigilance. This erosion of basic safety perception represented major harm beyond the immediate incidents. Children's victim impact came through parental observations and professional assessments. Some children developed separation anxiety, reluctance to be in public spaces, or fear of strangers that exceeded normal child development. The abductions created trust issues that would require ongoing support to address. Even children too young to fully say their experiences showed behavioural changes showing trauma. Courts stressed the seriousness of child abduction despite the lack of physical harm. The emotional damage to children and families, the harm of parental rights to custody, and the targeting of society's most at-risk members justified severe punishment. Physical abuse is not necessary for abduction to be a grave crime. The serial nature of Azzopardi's offending made sentencing more severe. Single incidents might receive some consideration for being aberrations, but repeated offending shows a pattern that suggests both deliberate choice and likelihood of reoffending if given opportunity. The court needed to protect the public from someone who had shown consistent willingness to abduct children. The use of deception and identity fraud as tools for child abduction received specific attention. Azzopardi's crimes were sophisticated in their social engineering aspects, but she did not act impulsively, but rather used practiced techniques to manipulate children and avoid detection. This sophistication made her crimes more concerning from a public safety perspective. The sentence needed to serve multiple purposes: punishing Azzopardi for the harms she caused, deterring others from similar crimes, protecting children during the prison time period. The court balanced these considerations when determining appropriate prison terms for each conviction. The children Azzopardi abducted were all physically safe following recovery, but the psychological impact continued to affect them after the incidents. Young victims of abduction often require ongoing therapeutic support to process their experiences and rebuild their sense of safety. The families worked with mental health professionals to address lasting effects. The case has been used widely in UK child safety training programs. Schools, parent groups and law enforcement agencies cite Azzopardi's methods when teaching children and adults about abduction risks. This case demonstrates how stranger danger can manifest through authority claims rather than obvious threatening behaviour. Azzopardi's name became synonymous with the danger of authority-based deception, teaching a generation of British children that confidence alone doesn't make a stranger trustworthy. This highlighted the danger of authority-based deception. Children are taught to obey adults and trust authority figures, but criminals can exploit this teaching by falsely claiming authority. Safety education now stresses that children should verify claims with their parents or known trusted adults, rather than right away complying with any authoritative statement from a stranger. Public awareness increased about the need to monitor children, even in seemingly safe public spaces. The locations where Azzopardi operated, parks, shopping centres, schools, were places parents before considered relatively get. Constant vigilance is necessary even in familiar, populated areas. The cross-border nature of the crimes prompted improved information sharing between law enforcement agencies in different areas. The pattern might have been identified sooner if systems for connecting similar crimes across regions had been more robust. Improvements to these systems help prevent serial offenders from exploiting aerial boundaries. Azzopardi's current status depends on completion of her sentences and any parole proceedings. Serial child abduction cases typically result in lengthy prison terms. Release would require demonstration that she no longer poses danger to children. Parole boards would consider psychiatric evaluations, behaviour during prison time, and victim input when making release decisions. The family's recovery from the trauma continued long after the legal proceedings concluded. Trust in public safety takes time to rebuild after such a harm. Parents who experience their children being taken may struggle with anxiety whenever their children are in public spaces. Professional support helps families process these lasting effects. The matter remains relevant for understanding how social engineering can help crimes against children. Physical force is not necessary when manipulation is effective. Azzopardi proved that confident lies and projected authority could enable serial child abduction. This recognition shapes how child safety is now taught and practiced. Hit like and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. Every subscription keeps us going. Samantha Azzopardi's victims at least got their children back alive, but the final case we're covering ends with a family who never got that chance. Case number 5, Melissa Huckabee. The taking the life of a child by someone known to the family represents betrayal at its most severe. When that person is a babysitter or familiar caregiver, the crime becomes not just tragedy, but harm of the most basic trust parents must extend to function in society. 8-year-old Sandra Cantu disappeared on March 27, 2009, in Tracy, California. The community mobilized right away, organizing searches and distributing flyers. Melissa Huckabee joined these efforts, positioning herself as a concerned neighbour. She was actually the killer. CNN reported Huckabee lived in the same trailer park community as Sandra's family. She was known to local families and occasionally babysat children in the area. This familiarity created access and delayed suspicion. However, when Sandra went missing, Huckabee did not become an immediate focus of investigation. She was a known quantity, a neighbour who seemed to care. The reality was far darker. Sandra's body was discovered on April 6, 2009, inside a suitcase that had been dumped in an irrigation pond. The 8-year-old had been kidnapped, assaulted, and took the life of. Evidence in the end traced back to Huckabee. The familiar babysitter had taken the life of the child she was trusted to help care for. The neighbour who helped search for Sandra Cantu had taken the life of her. transformed the investigation into a search for a killer who was hiding in plain sight the entire time. This revealed how familiar caregivers can exploit trust to commit the most serious crimes. Sandra knew Huckabee, but she had no reason to fear her. When Huckabee abducted Sandra that March afternoon, the 8-year-old complied because this was someone from her community, someone she recognised. The trust that made Sandra at risk came from months of normal, neighbourly interaction. Huckabee's participation in the search efforts represented psychological manipulation at its most disturbing. She attended vigils and spoke with other neighbours about the missing girl. She presented herself as helpful and concerned. This behaviour is not uncommon among killers who want to monitor investigations and appear innocent. The performance delayed suspicion, while Sandra's family suffered. The crime's location, within a small trailer park community, intensified the betrayal. These communities often function with higher trust levels than anonymous apartment complexes or suburban neighbourhoods. People know their neighbours, children play together. The assumption of community safety made Huckabee's crime more shocking. Melissa Huckabee's connection to Sandra Cantu's family came through their shared residence in the same Tracy, California trailer park. The community was small enough that residents knew each other. Sandra and other children played in common areas where Huckabee would see them regularly. This daily proximity created familiarity between Huckabee and the local children. Huckabee occasionally babysat children in the trailer park. She was not Sandra's main caregiver, but she was known as someone who would watch children when needed. This babysitting role established her as a trusted adult in the community. Parents felt comfortable with their children being around her, based on her neighbourhood presence and babysitting history. Huckabee didn't need to be Sandra's regular babysitter to gain the trust that would let her lure an 8-year-old away without suspicion. Huckabee had criminal issues unrelated to Sandra, recorded in court records preceding the taking of life. But these issues did not involve harm against children or offences. Background checks or public knowledge of these problems apparently did not raise enough concern to exclude her from community trust regarding children. The earlier offences seemed disconnected from childcare risks. No known disputes existed between Huckabee and the Cantu family before Sandra's disappearance. The families interacted as neighbours without major conflict. This absence of obvious tension meant the Cantu family had no specific reason to keep Sandra away from Huckabee, or to view her as dangerous. Community members later stated that Huckabee often sought attention and involvement in neighbourhood activities. She wanted to be noticed and valued within the community. This attention-seeking behaviour showed up in her participation in searches and vigils after Sandra went missing. The pattern suggests possible psychological needs for significance or recognition. No before police calls or reports linked Huckabee exactly to Sandra before the crime. The two had normal neighbourhood interactions without incidents that would have created documentation or warning signs. From external observation, Huckabee appeared to be a standard community member, with no specific connection to Sandra beyond living nearby. The trailer park setting created physical proximity that enabled Huckabee's crime. She could observe when Sandra left her trailer. She knew the routines of families in the community. This surveillance capacity came naturally from living in close quarters. Huckabee did not need to stalk from a distance. She was already part of the environment where Sandra lived and played. Sandra's family recognised Huckabee as a familiar adult rather than a stranger. This recognition was crucial to how the crime unfolded. Sandra would not have viewed Huckabee with the wariness appropriate to a stranger. The familiarity made Sandra at risk to whatever method Huckabee used to abduct her. March 27, 2009 began as a normal day in the Tracy Trailer Park community. Sandra Cantu was last seen walking to a friend's house that afternoon. She was alone, moving through familiar territory where she felt safe. The 8-year-old had made this walk before. She knew her neighbours and felt no danger in her own community. Melissa Huckabee was observed interacting normally within the community that day. Witnesses placed her in the area, but her behaviour did not right away signal anything wrong. She appeared to be going about her routine activities like any other resident. This normalcy was itself a cover for what she was planning, or had already done. Sandra walked toward a friend's house in a neighbourhood she trusted completely, unaware that someone she knew was about to transform from familiar neighbour to kidnapper and killer. After Sandra went missing, the community's response was immediate and intense. Neighbours organised search parties. Flyers with Sandra's photograph were distributed throughout Tracy and surrounding areas. Local media covered the missing child case widely. The entire community mobilised to try to find the 8-year-old. Huckabee volunteered in these search efforts. She attended vigils where Sandra's family and neighbours gathered to pray and hope. She spoke with other residents about the search. She positioned herself as a concerned community member, doing everything possible to help find the missing girl. This participation allowed her to monitor what investigators knew and to maintain her image as an innocent neighbour. Investigators later identified inconsistencies in Huckabee's statements during this period, but details she provided about her activities or observations did not align with other evidence or witness accounts. These inconsistencies became major once she emerged as a suspect. However, during the first search phase though, these discrepancies did not right away focus suspicion on her. No immediate warning signs were detected by the family due to Huckabee's familiarity. The Cantu family was focused on finding their daughter, but they did not suspect that someone they knew from the trailer park had taken Sandra. The assumption was that Sandra had encountered danger from someone outside the community, not from within it. The search lasted 10 days before Sandra's body was discovered. During this period, the family experienced hope mixed with growing fear. As days passed without finding Sandra alive, the likelihood of tragedy increased. The community's vigils took on more desperate tones. People prayed for a miracle, or fearing the worst. Huckabee's behaviour during these 10 days would later be analysed for signs of guilt or psychological stress. Killers who insert themselves into investigations and victim support efforts sometimes show tells that show their involvement. However, Huckabee apparently maintained her facade effectively enough that she was not immediately identified as the main suspect during the active search. Melissa Huckabee abducted Sandra Cantu sometime after the 8-year-old left her trailer on the afternoon of March 27, 2009. The exact circumstances of the abduction are established by evidence, but some details remain within investigation records rather than public disclosure due to the nature of the crime and the victim's age. Sandra was caught off guard by someone she knew and trusted, but she had no reason to resist or refuse to go with Huckabee. The familiarity between them removed Sandra's defences. When Huckabee approached her, Sandra likely viewed it as normal interaction with a known neighbour, rather than the beginning of an abduction. An 8-year-old who knew her killer as a friendly neighbour would have followed her willingly, never imagining that familiar face masked murderous intent. Sandra was restrained during the attack. Evidence recovered during the investigation showed she had been subdued. The restraint prevented her from escaping or calling for help. Huckabee controlled the child completely during the commission of the crime. Sandra was helpless against an adult who had decided to harm her. The assault of Sandra represents the most heinous aspect of the crime. An 8-year-old child was victimized in this way by someone who held a position of community trust. The harm was not just of Sandra's physical safety, but of her basic right to be protected by adults rather than harmed by them. Sandra took the life of after the assault. The cause of passing and specific method are part of the investigation record. Huckabee ended Sandra's life, eliminating any possibility of the child reporting what had been done to her. Taking a life was the final act in a crime that began with betrayal of trust and ended with the passing of a child. Huckabee placed Sandra's body inside a suitcase. This choice of disposal method suggests planning about concealment. Suitcases are designed to be sealed and are not transparent. The suitcase would hide the body from casual observation. The use of this specific container shows Huckabee was thinking about how to dispose of evidence. The suitcase was dumped in an irrigation pond near the trailer park. This location was close to the crime scene area, which is common in cases where offenders need to dispose of evidence quickly. The pond offered water that might deteriorate evidence and depth that might prevent immediate discovery. But irrigation ponds are also checked during missing child searches, which is how Sandra's body was eventually found. Huckabee returned to the community after disposing of Sandra's body. She resumed her normal appearance and behaviour. She interacted with neighbours who were organising searches. She attended vigils where Sandra's family was grieving. This return to normalcy required a major psychological ability to hide guilt. Huckabee had to act as though nothing was wrong, while knowing she had taken the life of a child. The evidence that in the end connected Huckabee to the crime came from multiple sources. Physical evidence linked her to the suitcase and to Sandra. The location of the disposal site was within Huckabee's access range. Her inconsistent statements during questioning raised suspicion. When confronted with mounting evidence, she eventually confessed to taking Sandra's life. Sandra Cantu's disappearance was reported by her family on the same day she went missing, March 27, 2009. The immediate report triggered a massive response from law enforcement, volunteers, and media. Missing child cases, especially involving children as young as 8, receive highest priority and maximum resource allocation. Tracy, California, where the crime occurred, is a city in San Joaquin County in the Central Valley. The city experienced rapid growth in the 1990s and 2000s as families moved there seeking affordable housing compared to the San Francisco Bay Area. The trailer park community where both Sandra Cantu and Melissa Huckabee lived consisted of working-class families who knew each other through daily interaction. Sandra Cantu was last seen on surveillance footage from the trailer park on March 27, 2009. Surveillance footage shows wearing a pink Hello Kitty shirt and black leggings. The 8-year-old was walking to a friend's house around 4 p.m. when she disappeared. The footage that captured her final movements would later become central evidence in the investigation and was widely shown on national news broadcasts, including CNN and ABC News. The massive search for Sandra involved hundreds of volunteers from the Tracy community and surrounding areas. Vigils were held as days passed without finding the girl. CNN and ABC News reporting documented Huckabee actively took part in these search efforts and vigils, speaking with neighbours and joining organised searches. Her involvement in looking for the girl she had taken the life of represented a calculated attempt to deflect suspicion. Sandra's body was discovered on April 6, 2009, 10 days after her disappearance, in an irrigation pond near the trailer park. A court statement reported by ABC News stated her body had been placed inside a suitcase that was dumped in the pond. The suitcase was later traced to Huckabee through physical evidence, including her DNA and fingerprints. The Tracy Police Department led the investigation with assistance from county and state resources. FBI involvement is common in child abduction cases. The search for Sandra included ground teams, air support, and large canvassing of the area. Every possible location where an 8-year-old might be found or hidden was examined. For 10 days, searchers walked past the irrigation pond where Sandra's body was hidden, while the woman who put her there helped organise the search parties. Community volunteers played a crucial role in the search efforts. Residents of the trailer park and Tracy more broadly wanted to help find Sandra. They distributed flyers, knocked on doors, and checked locations where a lost or hiding child might be. The scale of volunteer involvement reflected how strongly the community was affected by Sandra's disappearance. Media coverage was large from the beginning. Local news stations broadcast Sandra's photograph and description repeatedly. National media picked up the story as the search continued without resolution. The publicity served the dual purpose of spreading awareness that might lead to finding Sandra and applying pressure for investigative resources. Sandra's body was discovered on April 6, 2009, 10 days after her disappearance. The suitcase containing her remains was found in an irrigation pond during the search. The discovery shifted the investigation from a missing child to taking a life. The focus changed from rescue to identifying and apprehending whoever had taken the life of Sandra. The autopsy and forensic examination provided crucial evidence. The cause of passing was established. Evidence of assault was recorded. Physical evidence from Sandra's body and from the suitcase created investigative leads. Forensic science can identify traces that connect victims to offenders, even when efforts have been made to destroy evidence. Evidence traced back to Melissa Huckabee through multiple channels. The suitcase was eventually connected to her. Physical evidence linked her to Sandra. The location where Sandra's body was found was within Huckabee's range of access. As investigators compiled this evidence, Huckabee emerged as the main suspect. Huckabee at first denied involvement when questioned by police. This denial is common in criminal investigations. Suspects often claim innocence even when evidence exists against them. But as investigators presented more evidence and pressed harder during questioning, Huckabee's denials became less sustainable. Huckabee eventually confessed to taking the life of Sandra Cantu. The confession provided details about what had happened and confirmed investigators' evidence-based conclusions. Confessions are powerful prosecutorial tools because they represent the defendant's own admission of guilt. Even if a suspect later recants, the confession remains on record and can be used in court. The community reaction to Huckabee's identification as Sandra's killer was shock and anger. People who had searched alongside her felt betrayed. Sandra's family experienced rage at the person who had pretended to help while knowing she had taken the life of their daughter. The revelation that the killer had been among them the entire time was deeply traumatic. Melissa Huckabee was charged with kidnapping and taking a life in the passing of Sandra Cantu. The charges reflected the most serious crimes in California's penal code. First-degree life charges require proof of planning ahead and deliberation. The circumstances of Sandra's passing provided evidence supporting these elements. More charges related to the assault were included in the formal charges. These charges recognized the full scope of crimes Huckabee had committed against Sandra. Each charge carried potential prison sentences that could accumulate to ensure Huckabee would never be released if convicted on all counts. The prosecution would argue that a trusted neighbor had planned and executed the taking a life of a child, then hid behind a mask of concern while the community searched in desperation. The prosecution stressed the abuse of trust and familiarity in their case presentation. Huckabee had taken advantage of her position as a known community member and occasional babysitter to access and harm Sandra. This betrayal made the crimes more heinous from legal and moral perspectives. Prosecution statements indicated prosecutors argued that Huckabee had harmed the most basic expectations of adult behavior toward children. The defense raised mental health arguments during proceedings. Defense attorneys often present psychological evaluations and expert statements in court when defendants have committed crimes that seem impossible to understand or extremely harmful. The goal is to establish reasons that might reduce punishment, that might reduce criminal responsibility, or influence sentencing. But mental health issues do not excuse criminal acts, especially harmful crimes against children. California allows for the passing penalty in cases involving taking a life with special circumstances. The taking a life of a child during the commission of another felony, such as assault, qualifies as a special circumstance. Huckabee faced the possibility of capital punishment if convicted after trial. To avoid the passing penalty, Huckabee entered a guilty plea to taking a life and other charges. Plea agreements are common in cases where evidence overwhelmingly establishes guilt and where the defendant wants to avoid the most severe possible punishment. By pleading guilty, Huckabee accepted responsibility for taking Sandra's life. In exchange for removing the passing penalty from consideration, Huckabee at first denied involvement when questioned by Tracy Police Department and FBI investigators, but faced with mounting physical evidence linking her to the crime scene and the suitcase, she eventually confessed. ABC News reported she entered a guilty plea to avoid the passing penalty, accepting instead a sentence of bun. The court ruling stated life in prison without possibility of parole. Judge Thomas Tarley accepted the plea agreement and imposed the life sentence on July 2010. The court accepted Huckabee's guilty plea. The guilty plea removed the need for a trial where evidence would be presented and witnesses would speak in court. Legal proceedings continued directly to sentencing. The judge would determine the appropriate punishment based on the charges, the plea agreement terms, and evidence presented during the sentencing phase. Victim impact evidence was presented during sentencing proceedings. Sandra's family members provided statements describing how Sandra's taking a life had destroyed their lives. They explained the permanent void her passing created. They addressed the betrayal of trust that made the crime even more painful. Their statements ensured the court understood the full human cost of Huckabee's actions. The plea agreement specified that Huckabee would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence ensures she will never be released. Life without parole is the second most severe punishment in California's criminal justice system, below only execution. The sentence reflected the gravity of murdering a child. Melissa Huckabee received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was imposed after she pleaded guilty to avoid the passing penalty. Life without parole means Huckabee will remain in prison until she dies. There is no future possibility of release, parole, or reduction in her sentence. The judge stressed the severity of betraying a child's trust during sentencing remarks. Huckabee had taken advantage of her familiarity with Sandra and her position in the community to commit taking a life. The abuse of trust represented a reason to increase punishment that justified the harshest possible non-capital sentence. Courts recognize that crimes become more serious when offenders violate positions of authority or trust. Victim impact statements from Sandra's family detailed the severe and permanent loss of their daughter. Parents described how Sandra's taking a life had destroyed their sense of safety and normalcy. They explained that they would never recover from the trauma of losing their child in such a harmful and preventable way. The impact statements ensured that Sandra's humanity and the magnitude of her loss were central to the sentencing. Sandra's family members expressed rage at Huckabee for taking part in searches and vigils while knowing she had took the life of Sandra. The psychological cruelty of this behavior, watching a family suffer while pretending to help, intensified their trauma. The family members wanted the court to understand that Huckabee's crime extended beyond the taking a life itself, to include the torture of making them hope Sandra might still be alive. The community impact was also addressed during sentencing. The taking a life of a child within a small community affects everyone. Parents became fearful about their children's safety. Trust between neighbours eroded. The trailer park where Sandra had lived became a place of grief and fear rather than community. These broader impacts showed that Huckabee's crime harmed more than just Sandra's immediate family. The court highlighted that Huckabee's crime was among the most serious possible under California law. The taking a life of a child during commission of assault represented deliberate, planned harm against society's most at-risk member. No reasons that might reduce punishment could reduce the basic evil of what she had done. The maximum sentence short of passing was appropriate and necessary. The finality of life without parole meant Sandra's family would never have to endure parole hearings or fear Huckabee's release. In cases where parole is possible, victims' families must repeatedly relive their trauma at hearings to argue against release. Life without parole spares them this ongoing torture. Huckabee will die in prison, and Sandra's family will never have to face her as a free person. Melissa Huckabee remains in prison in the California prison system, serving her life sentence without possibility of parole. She will spend the rest of her life in custody. The sentence ensures she poses no future danger to children or the community. Her current facility assignment is part of the state's correctional system management. Sandra Cantu's taking a life permanently changed how the Tracy Trailer Park community viewed safety and trust. The taking the life of a child by a neighbour shattered assumptions about community security. Parents became more vigilant and more suspicious. But the easy trust that characterised the community before Sandra's passing could not be restored. The psychological damage extended beyond Sandra's immediate family to affect everyone who had lived in that community. The trailer park that once felt like a safe community where children could play freely became a place defined by the taking a life of one 8-year-old girl. The case is frequently cited in discussions about child safety and caregiver vetting. Sandra's taking a life showed that familiar adults can pose danger to children. The traditional stranger danger model of child safety education is incomplete. Children also need protection from people they know. Parents must remain vigilant even regarding adults who seem trustworthy based on familiarity. This reinforced that background checks and vetting, while important, cannot eliminate all risk. Huckabee had legal issues, but nothing that would have clearly flagged her as a danger to children. Some people who commit harmful crimes have know-before indicators that would appear in standard screening. Perfect safety cannot be achieved through screening alone. The tragedy prompted renewed focus on how children should respond to adults they know. Safety education now stresses that children should tell their parents if any adult, even a familiar one, makes them uncomfortable or asks them to do something that feels wrong. The focus expanded from stranger awareness to recognizing that danger can come from within trusted circles. Sandra's family continues to live with the permanent loss of their daughter. Parents who lose children to harm experience trauma that never fully resolves. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones Sandra should have experienced become painful reminders of what was stolen. The family's healing is ongoing and complicated by the knowledge that someone they had trusted took the life of their child. Media coverage of the case contributed to national conversations about child abduction and taking a life. Cases like Sandra's, where the killer is someone known rather than a stranger, receive specific attention because they challenge common assumptions about where danger comes from. The coverage ensured that Sandra's case would be remembered and that the lessons from her taking a life would inform future child safety efforts. The irrigation pond where Sandra's body was found became a site of mourning for the community. Memorial efforts honoured Sandra's memory while grappling with the horror of what had happened. Physical locations associated with harmful crimes can become psychologically major spaces where communities process grief and trauma. This case remains instructive about the gap between appearance and reality. Huckabee appeared to be a concerned neighbour helping search for Sandra. The reality was that she was a murderer, hiding her guilt through performance. This disconnect between public presentation and hidden truth is a pattern in cases where killers insert themselves into investigations. Law enforcement training now stresses watching for this behaviour as a potential indicator of involvement. The 5 cases share a disturbing pattern: trust transformed into weakness. Fatima Alexander, Nadine Manukau Togiavalu, Nadeja Hill, Samantha Azzopardi, and Melissa Huckabee all exploited their positions as trusted caregivers to commit crimes against children. Each case shows that danger sometimes comes from the people families trust most. Background checks, references, and screening processes help reduce risk, but cannot eliminate it entirely. The lasting lesson is simple. Parents must balance necessary trust with ongoing awareness. No system can guarantee perfect safety when childcare requires giving caregivers unsupervised access to children, but frequent communication, GPS tracking, regular check-ins, and rapid response to warning signs can help protect families from caregivers who abuse the trust placed in them. If these stories have shocked you, leave a like and subscribe. The more support we get, the more cases we can cover.